with this new game. So yeah, it's I don't know. Something about Zed is just like it drew me in right away, and I knew I had to like get in as early as possible. Like I know I missed out on like, you look back 2 years ago when ZED ones were like $100 or something, and everybody wishes that that's when they got in.
Yeah, or even February.
What were they in February?
Let's see. So the March 4th drop, I mean, they were still $7,000 for the March 4th drop, 4.5 ETH. But it's before that they would have been less. That was, I think March 4th was the first official drop.
Okay.
So am I choppy at all, guys? I guess my connection is coming back.
You seem fine.
Okay.
Yeah, it seemed okay to me. But yeah, in February, how much were they? Sorry, I think I missed that part.
I don't have data from February because they never really posted.
Hey MJ, what's up?
Scored. But these are the prices from when they did their first official drop, March 4th.
Wow, yeah, even then it was like
$10 in ETH.
Just crazy.
Yeah.
It's crazy how much it went up. Do you have any ZED ones, BG? You never posted your stable, eh? Trying to keep it secret?
Very secretive. No, it's not a secret. I do have a Z1, yeah. I forget which drop it was, but it was back when they were a lot cheaper than they are now.
That's a real horse.
my cousin has got a pony for his kid that she's learning to ride. Yeah, and the Z1 was more expensive.
Yeah, I bet. It's crazy. My grandfather has like a whole bunch of horses, but he doesn't like they're not like race horses or anything. It's just kind of like they're like Frisian horses, and they're really nice. But I can't even imagine what it would cost to get like a real racehorse. And someone was saying it's like $40,000 a year just to like board them and feed them, and
they're not as expensive to buy as you think. They're much more expensive to take care of than you think.
That would make sense.
You can go out to one of the smaller tracks in Los Angeles or up in the Northeast and claim a horse for $1,500 or $2,000, but finding a trainer and paying for a stable and paying the training fees. I mean that's the big positive of ZED, right? Because
no overhead.
You buy the horse, but you don't have to pay any of the overhead except to enter it into races and to breed it. So and for your time, the trainer's time, right? So but yeah, it's an interesting game. I have some buddies out in LA that there's a track called Los Alamitos, and we were talking about a track out on the West Coast called Los Alamitos, and we were talking about like, man, we should just go in on a horse or two together. It's too pricey.
I want to. I actually do want to breed a horse in real life now, because I won't have any overhead because my grandfather has the farm and we grow all our own hay. Yeah. And so it's like I won't have to pay for board and we won't have to pay for food. So it would be pretty cool to have one. But anyway, did you want to get into like breeding fees and stuff like that? I don't know how many people are.
Yeah. So we've got a few people in here. Appreciate everybody joining early on. Hey Gags, what's going on? As you guys can see, the people who have joined so far, you've got your normal crew, David and CJ, but you've also got a new person joining us tonight, the data wizard himself, BG. Again, I guess we've never asked if you're okay with us calling you that. We just kind of
call me BG.
Thing, yeah. So I meant more the data wizard than the.
The data wizard is also fine.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So we asked him to join us tonight to really dig into some of the the data that he's pulling and we're kind of looking through to try to understand, what breeding looks like. And I think the disclaimer for the night is, even though we have, call it,
hey Lacey,
50, close to 50,000. Hey Lacey, what's going on? Even though we have close to 50,000 bred horses in the ecosystem now, I think we are at 50,000. We're still very early. There's not a ton of data out there. We're focusing mostly on Gags. Appreciate the sub, man.
I think that we're gonna have to just make this stream about BG's background at this point. I think it's a big hit.
That's right. Hey Greeno, what's going on, man? So the kind of intro to the stream is, we want to dig into breeding tonight. We want to talk about how we're thinking about it, what things we're seeing, what that translates to. We're not going to provide a lot of financial advice or
this is not
concrete, like this is exactly what you need to do. But there are some things that are popping up that we want to kind of point out. But what we wanted to exactly, Greeno, this is all financial advice.
Yeah. So all I just wanted to add to that is that the way that I feel about like the information that we're going to give out is that, like, we're not going to give out specific information about how you should proceed with your stable, but I think that we're going to, like, there's enough information here with like the data that BG has pulled, with the charts that you've put together, and like everything else, that you can use this information to really do what you want to do, like, and right. It'll give you enough information to proceed in like the best way for your stable, I think. Because, like, I mean, we've all kind of had our moments of saying, breeding is completely random and all that other stuff, but like there's definitely elements of it that are not random, right? And there are some people that don't think it's random at all. But I think BG has some good data here that'll show some good stuff. Anyway, sorry, continue, David.
So yeah, no problem. I guess BG, did you have anything you wanted to add, or do we want to start with the fees and then I'll kick it over to you in a little bit? Either way, whatever works for you.
I would just say that if people have specific questions that they kind of want to see where the data or what the data looks like drop those in chat, and we can look at those at the end. But it would be awesome to have just a list to go through by then.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And Ice, before I jump into the fees, Ice, appreciate the sub, man.
Oh yeah, thank you. Anyone that follows or subs, like, deeply, deeply appreciate it.
So we wanted to start off tonight, while people are trickling in, with talking about the fees. I think most of the crowd that's watching us right now probably has a pretty good grasp of what the fees look like. But for those kind of watching after the fact, or those kind of tuning in, Heckman, yeah. So we'll jump into that. So what I've got pulled up right now is a little Excel spreadsheet kind of calculating the different fees for the different bloodlines and the different breed types. And so you've got in the middle what it's supposed to be, which is what ZED announced today, that they are rolling out on Friday, and they've got kind of a window carved out to basically take the stud farm down. I think roll out this new smart contract with these calculations correct, and then and basically have these prices going forward. So the current prices, as you all probably know, are this top chart. So they're all based in ETH, and they're all based on the Buterin minimums. So 0.036 for a Genesis, 0.032 for a Legendary, 0.027 for an exclusive, and that holds up the bloodlines. That doesn't change. So what they announced today is that this new smart contract and once the stud farm rolls back out, it'll be based on the calculations that are laid out in the literature, which for Genesis, you go from 0.036 to 0.051 for a Finny, to 0.099 or essentially 0.1 for a Zabo, and then 0.135 for a Nakamoto. And then you have kind of stair step down by 30%, or not really 30%, but a portion of 30% for each of your breed types. So a little bit lower for legendary, a little bit lower for exclusive. And then, the last thing this middle chart is what they're going to do on Friday. That's our understanding of it.
I think someone said that was confirmed, that they're only just implementing the existing breeding formula.
Right.
Stud fee formula, I should say.
Right. Exactly. And so that, the only reason I have this other chart pulled up is just to kind of be able to do math. So in the past, Zed mentioned potentially increasing the base fee. If they increase the base fee under the new calculations, you could see stud fees as high as this. But based on community feedback so far, I personally really hope they don't do this. I think this will really negatively impact breeding, especially across bloodlines, which I think is important for us, finding the right combinations of horses and finding, kind of figuring out breeding, which even if we breed every horse for the next 2 years, we're still not going to figure out the golden, the holy grail or anything like that. But I think being able to breed across bloodlines helps us kind of put together data and figure out how different horses fit well together. So, my last comment, again, going back to this, focus on this chart. To Heckman's point earlier, a lot of Nakamoto Genesis and Zabos are the minimum that they're kind of sitting in the stud farm is above this number anyway. They're generally in the 0.16 to 0.2 range for Nakamotos, 0.12 to 0.15 or a little higher for Zabos. And so for most of those, it really won't be impacted. The thing that will be impacted is, I think, as people are saying, is you won't be able to snipe for the butyrine prices for those kind of pricier studs. So just wanted to clear up. There were some chat in general chat today that suggested a lot of people didn't necessarily kind of understand what this chart looked like or what was being done. And so we wanted to kind of kick off a breeding discussion with arguably the most important part of breeding, of what it costs. So CJ, BG, anything that you guys wanted to call out, or anything else to add there?
Don't pay a premium for breeding. That's my PSA.
Yeah, I think that'll probably be apparent why you just said that as we get into the data. Yeah.
So
okay. So maybe I'll just give an overview of what we're going to be looking at. So basically, I think first we're going to go through and just kind of talk about some of the prevalent breeding theories that are out there. Maybe just touch on them really briefly, because I think the data will speak for itself. And BG has done a lot of work pulling. I can't remember how long did you say your code was at this point?
I just looked. It's like around 15,000 lines of code.
Nice.
And actually, I just looked at how many hours I've spent writing that code. I'm up to like 290 hours. So
yeah, BG probably spends more time looking at data than anyone else in ZED, if I had to guess. And we spend probably more time asking him for data than anyone else. So yeah, but basically we're going to be looking at. So first, we're going to be looking at, I guess, in a roundabout way, what makes a good breeder. We're going to be looking at different ZED number combinations. We're going to actually pull up the full chart this time, just to kind of show you guys just like what the popular combinations are, what it looks like. I believe the chart is any foal that has 30 or more races with average odds of 12 or less and a win percentage of 10 or more. So basically, like, just a good racehorse up to like the elite. Like, it includes everything, but like just something that is raceable. So like you don't want to include like obviously like 15 odd horses and stuff like that, at least right now. And I think further to that point is that what we're showing you now is just like it's more geared towards the current race environment. So these things can change. We're going to address, I think, the idea that there's a genetic algorithm in place that requires you to do inbreeding, or that traits can be passed down through bloodlines and so on. So I don't know where you guys want to start with this. If you wanted to start with maybe the highest correlation between where they get their in. So what we're going to refer to as like so base ability, we may at some point call it speed.
I'll call it speed.
We don't mean the speed of the horse. We're talking about their base ability. Yeah. So yeah, BG, I don't know if you wanted to kind of start.
So I guess what I'll say about, to kind of unmuddy the waters, is that base ability does impact speed, but it's hard to infer base ability from race times. So the race times, I think, get fuzzed, right? Because if you had otherwise, if you had the same 12 horses race multiple times, which is an experiment I've run, you'd expect to see the same ranges of times. And that would get boring, and I think people would notice. So I think the times are fuzzed. You can recover signal from them, but it takes a little more work.
Right. Mm-hmm. So I don't know what you want to do first. Like if you wanted to have maybe BG pull up some charts, or
no. So I think we can talk a little bit about some of the other theories first,
sure,
and then we can jump into the data. So one thing, T Sizzle, appreciate the sub, man. So there has been discussion, and I guess I'm still the biggest questioner of what this data is telling us versus what it isn't, or what, if it is conclusively debunking some of these other theories that are out there. I think I still have some implicit belief in inbreeding, like real life breeding, but I think we can talk a little bit about right now. It doesn't seem like there's as much of a genetic algorithm as some people think. BG, I think I'll defer to you there, you and CJ there, because I'm not as close to that. But I think at a high level, the theories that are out there are, there's a theory around Buterins being the most consistent breeders, and Nakamoto's having the most mutation, or the least consistent breeding. I think the data that we're going to shows that that's not really the case. At worst, they're on par, and more likely it's the opposite, like the intuition would tell you. So that's one. Then you have the idea of sort of the top best racers, or the top best horses carrying clearly the best ability rather than having the most variance. And they're able to pass that down. And there's an element of both kind of bloodline of the best horses versus and as well as inbreeding within those bloodlines. And I think there's a little bit more fuzziness. I don't think we can say anything conclusive about grandparents' passing ability or anything like that, but the data definitely suggests things. And again, BG, stop me, cut in if I'm completely mischaracterizing what we're going to be talking about tonight. But I think what other kind of things have you guys heard about? I think those are the two main ones that mainly get floated around.
Yeah. I mean, I think the one assumption that a lot of people make is that there is a genetic algorithm. And then there are a lot of assumptions around what characteristics are passed down by that algorithm. Some assumptions around how it works. Some assumptions around whether grandparents matter, whether like genes can skip a generation, whether inbreeding matters. And like MJ just said, abilities passed down from parents. And what Jeff said on the Twitter Spaces thing with ZG the other day, which is variability is not passed down to parents, and then he reconfirmed that ability is. I think it's the only thing. I don't think there's any genetic algorithm. I don't think inbreeding matters. I think this algorithm is extremely simple. And I hope at some point they implement a genetic algorithm, because I think it'd be cool. And I think it would allow for more strategy in breeding.
And I'm with BG on that as well. Like, based on everything that we've seen from the data, it doesn't support there being an algorithm in place. It doesn't seem like there's any. So when MJ, when you're referring to them saying that ability being passed down by parents, I think that people look at that and think racing ability, and they're not thinking of base ability, which are
it's
two
a very
different things. Because basically what and BG is the one that kind of like really set me onto this, was that what makes a horse strong in the current racing environment is not their base ability. Like, I mean, sorry, it is derived from their base ability, but it's their variability and their distance preference, right?
Yeah.
So, and those are things that are not inherited through breeding. At least there's no evidence in the data that they're inherited through breeding. And I think the variability part, at least, was definitely confirmed that it's not.
Yeah.
So I mean, like, you can have a horse with incredible base ability, and it can breed with another horse with incredible base ability, and they will pass that on to an extent. And I think BG will go more into detail about how much is passed on and everything.
Right.
But if you don't get that high level of variance when they're born, then they're still not going to be like they can't perform against the horses that do get that high dose of variance. And a lot of horses with like even lower base ability will be able to beat horses with high base ability if they have just like really highly tuned variance and distance preference. So sorry to cut in there, BJ or BG.
All good.
BJ.
I think the other thing to kind of answer MJ's question in chat, I think if we're not big believers in speed here on this stream, but if you do look at speed variance or variance of racing performance, you generally tend to see higher variance in times and in performance based on or leading to your kind of U-shaped charts. So the super U's or the kind of more the natural U's that you're seeing tend to have higher standards of deviation, higher variance built into their racing performance. And so in our minds, that's a pretty clear indication of kind of variance over ability for those horses. But that doesn't mean that they have low ability. Or low base ability that they could pass on. So, to MJ's point, it is a combination of that variance at birth with whatever base ability the horse is getting, whatever portion of it, or however the parents are combining to pass that on to their child. So, BG, go ahead. I'll let you get back into it.
Yeah. So you mentioned speed variation, which I thought was interesting, because I just made an attribute the other day where I looked at all of the finish times for a horse, but I didn't look at the times. I looked at the winning time and the 12th place time, and then I calculated the percentile of every finish of a given horse within those times. And if you look at the standard deviation of that and compare it to another measure of variability, like their average odds order position difference. So like you look at the odds order first through 12th in every race they run versus their actual finish order. In high variability horses, you see that number is very high because they're ranked first in odds and then they finish 12th, for example, and very low for donkeys who are ranked 6th in odds and finish 6th or 7th, for example. So you find that the finish time standard deviation explains 78% of the variance in the average odds order position difference. So those are very highly correlated measures of variance. So I think, like that's an example of a kind of signal you can recover from speed. You're not actually looking at the
speed itself,
speed numbers
time.
themselves. You're looking at the kind of percentile changes or the
Right.
variation in the percentiles that they finish within a race.
That's the type of speed we believe in.
Yeah, and I think MJ and I actually talked about this kind of briefly, and I think I mentioned it on the other stream, is that like the other thing about time is that the only way to get at speed or at times for horses is to actually like run them in races and then get their like finishing positions and see the odds and all that other stuff. One thing that, you know, I think would be really cool for them to implement, and I'm like I said before, is if they had some kind of training track or like some kind of, you know, home stable field that you could practice running your horse on, and the only thing it gave you is their finishing time, rather than like they wouldn't have any position obviously, and they wouldn't be running against other horses. And like maybe at that point you could start using that kind of information to kind of help you determine, but I don't know how that would work with the way that times work right now. But anyway, PG, did you want to pull up some kind of graph or something to start heading into some of the data like visually? I know that like we've been talking about it a lot, but I think like sometimes when you see the data visually and have it explained, it's a lot easier to kind of grasp what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Yep, let me share.
And also because I am the living embodiment of that meme that asks you to explain it to me like I'm 5 years old.
I'm going to turn off my camera while I share, because I don't think my computer can do that majestic green screen and share my screen at the same time.
Oh, nice.
So this program is called XYZED. It is fantastic if you have a Mac. I cannot recommend it enough. Am I still sharing, by the way? Can you still see this?
Yeah,
right?
Yeah,
right?
We can see it. We can see
okay,
it.
Perfect. Yes, Mac only is the only annoying part. But you know, you can play with this in RStudio. There's lots of different things you can play around with this in. This is that relationship I was just talking to you about. This is the finish time percentile standard deviation versus the average odds order position difference. And so if I clear this filter, you can see I'm actually tracking 600 attributes for every horse in the game right now, which like see, it's a number that seems to grow daily. Lots of them were just like you know, wild ass guesses. Somebody in the Step Discord asked, you know, is there any you know, correlation with name lengths and anything? So of course I had to go see if there was or not.
Yeah, that was something that I think got put out at some point about the names mattering in terms of racing ability, and I was just
coffee and pizza,
flabbergasted.
All good horses.
Yeah.
And MJ, just as a disclaimer, I am completely anti-Mac, so that should balance BG's data analysis on a Mac. I'm not sure how he actually does it. How I didn't realize Macs could like process data, but that's another discussion for another day.
We use Macs at my day job, and we do a lot of data analysis and engineering. So
that's the first time I've ever heard of that.
Okay, so do you want to start with the maybe the mean class?
Oh yeah, the class mean. So if we look at the class mean, and then I look at everybody with 50 or more races, and then
just to cut in with BG's data, a lot of the time what we're doing is looking at data that it's all about all paid races and 50 or more races, just to kind of get like, I mean, it's not a huge sample size necessarily, but yeah.
Hey Dan Shan, what's going on? We can talk about it in the DMs at some point. I appreciate you tuning in though. And thanks for the follows, guys. Those of you who have followed in the last few minutes.
Yeah, I because I'm in the studio, I can't actually see who's like following and doing all that stuff, but we very much appreciate it.
All right, so what we got here is, okay, so first I'll describe what class mean is. It is the mean of all of the classes of all of the races a horse has raced. So the simple example is if you've raced 10 times in class 1 and 10 times in class 2, your class mean is 1.5. because you've split equally between those two classes. It's very hard to have like no one will have a perfect class 1, but you do see very good horses with like a 1.1 or 1.2 because you start below class 1, right? So you're always going to have some non-class 1 races. Part of the reason that we use 50 races as a minimum is to kind of eliminate that bias. But you also have horses who start and then immediately drop, so it works both ways. And what this is showing us is, so I filtered to all horses with 50 or more races, horses that are not bred. So we're just looking at Genesis horses, right? And I've split this out by genotype. And so you can see the class mean by genotype here. It looks, it's quite a pattern, right? We have our, and I can show you this in a dot graph as well. But Z1s end up in class 1 more often than not, and Z10s end up in class 5 more often than not. And the 5 here is the cutoff, right? You can't get higher than a 5.0
at this time.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
In the current meta.
Yeah, in the current meta. And I think this kind of like follows the logic of what you would think, like when looking at, a Z1 is supposed to be the pinnacle, like the best horse, or in theory. And the Z10s are like, I mean, they're all Genesis horses, but it's like this is like the varying ability you see, right? Where like Z1s are expected to have the highest base ability and Z10s are expected to have the lowest, if like within a certain range, right?
Mm-hmm. You can also see, let's see, if we look at all horses, you see anything, everything kind of gets clustered in the far end. That's outside that. You get some 13s up in low 4s, but outside of that, and there's also an inherent bias here because people stop racing bad horses before 50 races. So we would actually see, I think, that these are the standouts, right? So like these Z12s, Z13s, these are probably the better racers of the Z12s and 13s. So maybe they have higher variance, and so they're positive ROA.
Okay, and just to be clear about that line that comes out of the larger block,
so
that's like the range, right?
Yeah, this is the range of the measure, right? So there's this is the extreme outlier, and the other extreme outlier, and then the black line in the middle here, that's our median, and these are the two quartiles, the 20 or wait, what is it? The 25 to 50 and 50 to 75.
75,
Yeah. Yep.
And that's basically just showing that, like, even though a Z10 will generally be a class 5 horse, there are some Z10s that can make it into class 1. There are some Z10s that are Z9s that can make it into class 1, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. So this is the dot graph. So you can see how rare it is that those Z10 Genesis with 50 plus races do make it into to have an average class of up in the ones. So there's just a handful of them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Like
Dan,
Mula, for example.
Dan Shen, that is a good point. And we kind of talked about that a little bit of 90+%. I would say over 90% of bred horses never see 50 races.
Yeah.
That we were just kind of showing the ranges here, just as an example of what some of the other genotypes looked like. The analysis that we're looking at here on kind of where horses fall on the range is really focused on the Genesis horses.
Mm-hmm.
So
and looking at them as parents, right? Because like what you're going to see is that, and what something that BG is going to explain is that largely what determines the base ability of a foal is just the combination of the base ability of its parents, right? And there's obviously like an element of RNG involved there in terms of how much of that base ability they inherit. And then what really makes them a racer after that is having that base ability and then adding variability and adding distance preference. And those are the two like really big determining factors, but like base ability is so important. And one thing that you'll see, like when we were talking about, say, the mutation theory that I believe it was ZG that put it forward, that, it was that Z1s had the highest mutation rate, so they were least like their parents, and Buterins had the lowest mutation rate, which meant they were most like their parents, and like you had to breed them together to get the most consistent offspring. And so that's just not really the case that we're seeing in the data, where it's just like pretty much all foals have the same level of quote unquote mutation. They just inherit their base ability from their parents and then have a certain amount of RNG involved that kind of determines what their base ability is. BG, maybe you could field this question, but as far as I understand, there's no difference between breeding ability and base ability. Like your base ability is your breeding ability.
Right. So I think when people talk about breeding ability, they are talking primarily about ability to breed a plus ROI horse. And I think that plus ROI often comes more from variability and distance preference than it does from base ability. What base ability seems to do is put you somewhere in the class hierarchy, right? So we have, and to address Dan's point, here's the 50 race minimum. And if we just look at all of them, they all drop quite a bit. So I think that shows accurately what you were saying, Dan, is that most bred horses don't make it to 50 races because they're donkeys. And if you include those in the analysis, you see all those numbers drop by quite a bit. And so what the hell was I talking about?
Yeah, we're talking about breeding ability versus racing ability.
You're right. Yeah. So that racing ability, I think, comes from the more from distance preference and variability than it does from base ability. Base ability is just going to stick you somewhere between 1 and 5, and in a fractional way, right? Like you might be right on the cusp of between 1 and 2. So you're going to race equally in between those two classes. It might put you squarely in the middle of class 3. And you're going to do great because you have high variability, and you're just going to 1 and 12 to the bank. It might put you at the bottom of class 5, and you're going to waste a ton of money because you're never winning. And so that's really, I feel like there's multiple. Well, I feel like there's 2 ways to have a good racer based primarily on base ability, and that's either you're at the top of class 1 and it doesn't matter what your variability or distance preference is because you're just always winning. And I feel like
is that even possible though? Like it would even be possible. Like that's like a roid rager type thing, right?
Exactly.
Like,
that's exactly what I was going to say. Is like that's roid rager. Yeah.
Yeah, but in terms of like an actual bred racer, like in theory, that shouldn't be possible, right? Because like you're gonna have, say, like a varying range of base ability that comes from like, say, 2 Z1s together, which in theory should create the highest possible base ability for a foal. But because of the existence of variance, you're always gonna have like something that has like a similar base ability but a higher level of variance. So like being able to race on base ability alone will never make you the best racer in the current environment.
Right. Yeah, I do think you have to have some amount of variability and some amount of distance preference, which distance preference just seems like a modifier on base ability. I don't know if it's multiplier or just or if it's additive. But I think you go ahead.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say, I think the other way to answer this question, or to kind of flip what you guys have been saying, is in our mind, since variance can't be passed from parent to offspring, breeding ability is more a measure of base ability, whereas racing ability is a combination of that base ability with variance, and that variance can either take an overall ability variance, or I think, BG, the way you look at it is more a specific distance preference or set of distance preferences. The racing ability manifests itself that way, and so it's a combination of how good your horse is plus how great it can be from race to race. So I think that kind of takes what we're talking about here and frames it a little bit differently. But
and I think something important to remember about base ability in terms of like what BG was saying, like it tells you kind of what class. I would almost look at it like what the cap of what class you can fall to, so to speak. Like the reason why you don't see a lot of like legendary Nakamotos further than, say, class 2 is because their base ability is typically so high that even with like a healthy dose of like variability and distance preference, they're too strong to really finish in last place consistently, or at least a lot of them are. Yeah,
I think that's a good way to put it. And that's what I meant about it. The base ability puts you into the class hierarchy somewhere, right? It might be middle of 3, it might be cusp of 1, but you're going to usually beat horses from lower in the hierarchy, unless they have much higher variability or distance preference than you. And what I was getting at here around distance preference is this is just for all horses with, let's see if I can make this a little more detail. For all horses with 50 races, I should probably do a different metric for this just so I can include races of 1600 and some other distances. But what I'm basically looking at is mean difference from their 1600 odds to their odds in other distances. And you'll see that for most horses, their odds in other distances are different and lower than in 1600. There's probably so if we look at 1000, for example, a very long tail here of horses who do much better in 1000 than in 1600. And that tail here, let me turn off zooming so we can see the same scale for all of these. Actually, will it let me look at all of them?
So something that BG has mentioned before, just while you're looking for the chart, is that the thing that makes, because I think a question came up in the chat about spike horses, and the thing that makes a spike horse, quote unquote, a spike horse, is that they just have extreme distance preference, right? And because 1600 as a distance doesn't have that variable turned on.
Yes. So right. So just like your horse's distance preference does not apply in 1600. No one's horse does, because 1600, for whatever reason, is the distance they chose to not have distance preference apply. Distance preference seems to be, in my data, a modifier with some bias, meaning some horses have a bias towards long, some horses have a bias towards short. But if you have a high distance preference, you'll do better in both. The further you get from 1600 in either direction. So like if we imagine the horse with the highest distance preference in the game, it would do much better in 1000 and 2600 than it does in 1600. But depending on its bias, it would do better in one or the other if it's
right. And that explains the spike horses, right? Where in terms of like you have extreme bias towards, say, like the 2400 range, or you have extreme bias towards 1000, like say like the Crimson Chin, or going the other way, Mula Mula, where because I would imagine that these horses have low variability, right?
Not always.
Okay.
I think you still. You can have like a very high base ability, very high distance preference with lower ability than you would otherwise need. But imagine you are the Goldilocks horse with all three of those very high.
Right.
Yeah, then you're doing a lot of winning.
Like a Mula Mula or Crimson Chin, I suppose.
Yeah.
Princess of Power.
Yeah, actually, I like her better than Mula Mula, partially because she's a bred horse.
MJ, I'm gonna obviously let the other guys chime in, but to your question, how much does genotype factor into racing ability? I think the average class data suggests some correlation between base ability and Z number, but the variance, I don't think there's I don't think there's a conclusive thing we can point to that says that that different Z numbers are still impacted by variance. The one thing you don't see, though, is a lot of Z1s and Z2s down in lower classes. But otherwise, even if you look at some of the top Z1 racers, you still see the ability for them to get bottom 4 finishes. So CJ, I don't know, or BJ,
Yeah.
you guys have any?
No, I don't
Yeah.
think so, MJ. The variance is not impacted at all by the genotype.
Yeah, and that's actually the graph I pulled up here. So if we take average odds order position difference as a proxy for variance, and then we look at, I think I just grabbed the top 19 genotypes here, or 18 rather, we can see that it does not affect the variance. Yeah. And if we look at,
and I think you had some charts that showed that there was some slight variance in variance between bloodlines, but it wasn't really material, right?
Yeah. So this could be, there could be, it looks like there is a small difference between them, but I'm very curious if does that go away if we look at Genesis or not. So here's Genesis, and then here's bred. So that's interesting. I think that merits more research. What was the other measure of variance we looked at earlier? The finish time percentile mean. So yeah, there is some pattern there. I think we would have to control for class mean as well,
right?
Because these, the lower you get, the lower the class you're in, and then that's going to put you against different competition. And so we would want to control for that.
Right. It's not that there's necessarily a variance in time between classes, even though there is a slight decline as you. I don't think it's a material decline, but others do. But to your point about competition, I think that's more of what could be impacting it.
So the other thing that I think, no, the two multipliers are distance preference and variance.
The two right.
On racing ability, on how you perform in the current racing environment.
The question is whether they're multiplicative or additive, right? But yeah, I mean, how they work together.
Yeah, the three racing components are base ability, variability, and distance preference. And at 1600, it's just straight up base ability and variability, because distance preference does not seem to apply there.
Right.
So it isn't that those races specifically are an interesting data set on their own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I saw the question a little bit further up, and I don't want to go into it in too much detail, but he was, if you could pull up Alpha Bulldog's question, how do you determine base ability, and what two should mix as a better horses to breed with other better racers? So inherently, because really good racers have a high level of variability and distance preference, it's actually really more difficult to kind of determine what their base ability might be, aside from a general ballpark, because if they can't drop past class 2, obviously they have at least a certain level of inherent base ability that's pretty high, but it's really hard to put them on a scale. And what we've been working on for probably 2 weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, we've been trying to isolate what base ability looks like. And it's difficult, but we're also going to show some other stuff about because you're asking about which two horses to mix. We're going to look at a ZED combination chart that David pulled together from some of the data that BG pulled down, and it'll kind of show you the success rate mixing different ZED combinations and what they look like in terms of, it'll be 30 races or more with 12 or lower odds and a 10% or higher win rate. Will be kind of our criteria for at least a raceable horse. And again, something that was kind of pointed out earlier on the stream is that these are the horses that kind of made it through, you know what I mean? These are the horses that people keep on racing past the Griffey, or, because there's a lot of 15, 20 odds horses that people still throw into races.
Dan, one thing I wanted to clear up, Dan, that's not what we're saying at all. What we're saying is that Or go ahead, BG.
Yeah, I wanted to address that. You can have a horse that beats Mula at 1600, and that would indicate to me that they have a higher base ability, but that they may get destroyed at every other distance against Mula, because unless they have a higher distance preference themselves, which is probably not the case. And so you'll see. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, but it's also possible to beat Mula at 1600 and not have a higher base ability because of variance, right? Because that still exists. That still exists at 1600. You still have variance at 1600. You just don't have distance preference. So in theory, if you have a super high dose of variance, but your base ability maybe isn't as high, you could still be beating horses at 1600 that have a higher base ability than you do.
Okay, so where do we want to go next?
Yeah, well, right, and that's what we're trying to do, Dan. And this is something that we talked about before, because like something that we were doing to try and isolate base ability. I'm not going to go into the exact details, but like there was something we were doing, and then I was saying, well, we're looking at the entire race distribution of each horse, but realistically, if you're trying to take out as much noise as possible, you want to focus on 1600, because at that point, the only thing you have to account for is variance. The only problem with that is that it's really hard to get a large sample size at 1600 from a large group of horses, because most horses, if they're not successful at 1600, will race at the distance that they have the distance preference.
Their preference. Right. If they're spikers, they're not going to run a lot of races there, so.
Yeah, exactly. So it's just really hard to get like a really good look at the entire population of horses in terms of base ability solely from 1600, because most horses are not going to run a significant amount of races there.
And Dan, to your point, he could be the most powerful racer, but that doesn't mean that he can pass that on to his offspring. So, because again, each horse's variance and each horse's distance preference aren't passed on to their offspring.
They're not inheritable. So actually, maybe what we can do is, BG, why don't you pull up the amount of ability, racing ability, that is passed on from parents to offspring.
Oh, right. So comparing.
So this is where BG and I kind of disagree a little bit, and not necessarily like fundamentally, but he says that you can never have an offspring that has a higher base ability than its parents. And I disagree. Oh, and not so much that I disagree, but I'm just saying that you can't say that conclusively, because there's so much noise with variance and distance preference that you can't, like, for me, if a horse is outperforming its parents, it could be because it got a high dose of variance of distance preference. But I also feel like there is a small chance that it also inherited more base ability. Like I just got a higher multiplier. Like maybe it's, if you want to say, because I think your data shows that there's a 0 to 10% drop in base ability from parents to their offspring, right?
Yeah, and I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say never. I just that the data doesn't make me think so. Right. So I also wanted to answer Cryptog's question about why 3 variables. Sure. They are the 3 variables that ZED has said exist that I find actual evidence for. So, they've talked about base ability, they've talked about variance, they've talked about distance reference, they've talked about other things. And I went looking for, so like gait preference, for example, I find there's no correlation. So there may be more variables. I'd actually be super interested if anyone has any evidence for additional variables. These are the ones that ZED has talked about in public that I find actual, that have explanatory power.
So to your point, BG, I mean, there or Crypto G, I don't know if you're kind of going this direction. There will be additional variables, right? So they've mentioned gait preference could be a thing. They've mentioned weather. They've mentioned track type. We know that gait and weather are implemented in the current system, but they're not turned on, right? So weather is always sunny, and gait preference that, to your point, BG, that there's no evidence of any sort of influence there yet, right? So but I guess what you're saying is that these are the three that you've kind of isolated, and they've talked about other kind of real life horse racing variables that will be implemented at some point, but there's no evidence that those are in yet. Right?
Yeah, and I think I meant to say this kind of at the beginning, and maybe I did, but like the whole like caveat with all of this stuff that we're presenting right now is like this is all relevant to the current racing environment and the current breeding, I guess you could call it algorithm. It's more of a formula. That could change. Like I think even Jeff said that they might change the breeding formula in the future. We know that there's going to be racing changes in the future and different variables that would change. Would it be proof that base ability doesn't decrease as generations go? I don't know what you mean by that. You mean would Y2K be proof that base ability doesn't decrease? Well, BG is saying that there is potential for there to be a 0% decrease, which would mean in theory, if you took two really high base ability parents and they bred, you could get the highest possible base ability from the combination of those two parents. That's still a possibility.
So we see, this is the child class mean by the parent, the average of the parent class means, and we do see horses that are above. They end up in a class higher than their parents, but on average, it's lower. And there, I have a, let's see, so distance from the parent average class mean. You can see that here's the zero line. So all of these horses end up in a lower class than their parents, and then all of these horses, much fewer of them, end up in a higher class.
And you think that largely the reason that a child would end up higher than their parent is more due to their dose of variance and distance preference rather than actually having a higher base ability? I
think given that we kind of know that there are these other variables with explanatory power, that I don't know, it makes sense to me that because we know those variables can change, that those can explain that variance to be above the parent class. And I think on my kind of short list to do is to look at, okay, so let's look at all the children who race in a higher class than their parents. Can we compare the child distance preference to the parent distance preference? Can we compare the child variability to the parent variability, and see if those two differences explain why the child is in a higher class?
So when we're looking at, and I think the biggest thing with, at least with breeding right now, is I think the highest focus in breeding is people want to be able to breed horses that are good racers in the current environment, right? So I think, and I think we'll show this in data later on, the biggest thing, is that to get a good racer, and the reason why we say it's largely random is not because you can't control the amount of base ability that is being made, like when you put two horses together. Although, again, you have to try and isolate that base ability beyond just putting in like a low Z into a high Z or something like that. Is that once you have that base ability, it still is at the mercy of whatever dose of variance and distance preference that they randomly assign to the horse. And they've said that like this is in the documentation, and they basically admitted it on the Twitch talk. No, not Twitch, Twitter Spaces.
Yeah, Twitter Spaces.
He basically said that, variability or variance is not inheritable. We know that it's assigned randomly at birth. So that being like one of the key factors of what makes a good racer in the current environment means that you can put the two best horses with the highest base ability together as much as you want. If you get really unlucky, you're not going to get a good racer out of it, because they still need that variance and that the distance preference to be tuned up to beat the other horses that maybe have slightly less base ability or even a heavy dose of less base ability. But because they've got those extra, let's call them racing like variables, then they're still going to outperform them on the track in its current environment.
And even if you're putting together two, higher Zs, then they're going to be starting in a higher class. and be facing tougher competition. So, your average, the odds of you having a low average odds, high performing racer are even lower. So,
yeah, exactly.
Sean versus all, appreciate the sub, man. Appreciate you guys dropping in.
Oh yeah, thanks, man. And I think we're going to show that. Did you want to switch off for a second, BG, and maybe we could pull up that ZED combination chart? And I think, David, did you just mention this? I think I just missed that, but I think one of the biggest things and one of the biggest factors in breeding a profitable racer in the current environment is like kind of knowing what environment you're going into. So like when you're breeding a Z1 and a Z1 or a Z1 and a Z2, chances are the base ability is going to be so high that those horses are only really going to live in class 2 and class 1, which is where the best horses race already. So when you look at this data and you see, oh wow, like only 5% of all Z1 and Z2s when breeding together, they don't race successfully. And it's not because they're bad horses. It's just because they're only going against the best horses. Whereas when you see kind of, and I think the chart that David put together really accentuates this, is that, like, let's just say you look at Z5s or Z8s, which are going to be the standouts on this chart, is that when they're racing, they can kind of almost pick and choose their class because their base ability can still be high, but not so high that they aren't able to drop, which means that they have softer competition that they can run against. They can pick their class. Well, not pick their class, but they can move up and down classes.
I wanted to address a couple of the things in chat real quick.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think Cryptog's point about the noise being a plus is something I came around to as well, right? Like you don't want people with the best horses in the game absolutely dominating with that runaway lead. So I think breeding will always be noisy. And
it
then,
should be.
Yeah, and I think regarding Goomba's point, I think it doesn't like it didn't kind of ruin it for me. I didn't really go into it thinking there was this like fancy genetic algorithm and we're going to like figure out how the crossover works and how the phenotypes work. I think that could be a future improvement, right? I think we'll see breeding get more complex. I think Jeff really alluded to that in the kind of same Twitter Spaces thing where he said, variance isn't passed down. He said it slightly less strongly than that. He said mostly what's passed down is base ability, which I think was just, I interpret that as a kind of, he wanted to leave some vagueness in there. It didn't ruin it for me. And I think you can use the information to breed more efficiently, right? Like number of foals is maybe more important than the quality of the parents or spending a lot to get a super ultra premium stud.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's just one of those things that kind of further to what Crypto is saying is that like having that noise in there is really important for the game to still be a game, right? Because like if you take that out, it just becomes, the people who have the best horses breed the best horses, and you kind of like hope you can buy an offspring that is maybe unraced or blah blah blah. But anyway, sorry, David, do you want to pull up that chart?
Yeah. Yeah. So essentially, what this chart is saying, and before I kind of jump into that, MJ, I think you'll see you had a comment about combining Nox and Buterins. We'll get into that here a little bit, but I think your premise is generally correct that mashing together a base ability with getting a lower Z and being able to enter kind of lower end races is definitely an idea. Go ahead, CJ.
I just was going to say, just because I think it's an important thing to kind of to highlight. Do you want to just pull up Goomba's comment right now?
The latest one, or
the latest one about BE. Yeah, this is something that we've been kind of talking about a lot from the beginning. Is that because there is so much noise in breeding, like, yes, you're going to more likely get a higher base ability horse out of that, but you really have to look at like what that means and how that affects the current racing environment. Like, if your goal is to create a good racer, then spending an ETH or 2 ETH on a polka with a Z1 or something, you're going to have a better chance, but you're still looking at like a 95% chance of not having something that's going to be profitable, and the likelihood of being able to sell it as something that will profit after the breed is like, you just have to look at your own kind of what your profit margins are and like how much you're willing to give up from like what they're worth as soon as they're bred versus how much you're paying for the stud, right? And I think it's really important that, like, you know, I don't know, it's just you will create horses more likely that have a higher base ability, but it won't always translate to the racetrack. And if that's what you're chasing, then you're like BG was saying, it's probably better to just breed a lot of horses rather than spending a lot of money on one like expensive stud.
Right. And I think, or go ahead, BG.
I was going to say, I got a graph I can show to kind of illustrate this if you want.
Yeah, sure. Maybe before we jump into the ZED chart.
Yeah. I'll pull this back down if you want to share.
Yeah.
While BG, while you're pulling that up, you know, Alpha's comment is
I think
walk and how cheap.
I am tired. I didn't sleep at all last night.
And I don't, you know, I think there are some differing opinions on this panel there. I think there is some value in paying for proven breeders, but it's all about it should be all about your expected value, right? So there are certain breeders that are probably better. There are certain breeders that can most likely or potentially pass on more of their base ability. And so if those studs are listed, or if those mares are available for sale, or if those studs are listed for X stud fee, and it's only a certain amount above, you know, your average stud fee or your minimum stud fee, then it makes sense to pay up to those studs. What I think CJ and I strongly believe, and I believe BG does as well, but I don't want to put words in his mouth, is, you know, paying 1 ETH or more for any stud is likely going to be minus expected value. Because you only have such a percentage of hitting on a horse, and if you're paying, and if you don't hit, then that horse is going to be worth X, which is likely a lower value than 1 ETH. If you do hit, your horse will be worth more. So it's just a probability game, right? So, but that said, everything is about edge. Everything is about how wide those probability differences are. And what we're trying to figure out is what that looks like. So I think Dan Shan mentioned finding breeders. There are likely horses that are better breeders. But Dan Shan, I think you've also made the point in the past that edge might be as low as 1% or 3%. Well, if the edge is 1 or 2 or 3%, then why would you pay 7 ETH versus 0.2 ETH or 0.25 ETH or 0.15 ETH? So that's kind of how we're approaching this. BG, I don't know. Do you have a chart to pull up, or CJ or BG, do you have anything else to say there?
It's shared. You got to put it up on screen though.
Okay.
There we go. So this is so these are both measures of variability, right? The difference in your odds order versus your final position averaged across all your races. And we see 0.9% or 0.009 R squared between these two measures. So variability does not seem to, or rather, it may explain 0.9% of the variation between parent variability may explain 0.9% of the variation in child variability is a way to say that. But if you look at something like the class mean, versus the parent class mean or parent average class mean. The average parent class means explain 50% of the difference of the variation in the child's class mean. So that to me is like, okay, yeah, that's passed down directly. I don't know if we have the exact way it's passed down dialed in, but it seems highly heritable versus the variation. Like that 0.9% is small. As Dan said, maybe it is. Maybe you can find that 0.9%, and then David, to your point, maybe it's not worth 70. It may be worth something that's kind of left for us to calculate.
For you to decide, right? Exactly.
There's no like, is there in all the data that we've seen, there's no real correlation between the racing ability of not the racing ability, but like say the variation and distance preference being passed down to other horses. Like a good racer in the current environment does not necessarily mean that they're going to be passing any of that down. It's just the base ability that seems to have a high correlation, right? That's
the only thing I've found evidence for.
Yeah.
And I'll say that, me not having found evidence for it you shouldn't view that as conclusive, right? There may be other ways to look at this data. I've looked at it, like I said earlier, for like 300 hours now, and haven't found it yet. But if you think there's a metric I should look at, if you think there's an attribute that I should put into this analysis, I'm all ears, and always willing to kind of test theories.
There's no way that there's enough evidence to prove that there are good breeders, like aside from their base ability.
Early success doesn't mean
that could be pure
previous success doesn't mean future success. It could mean that they're better breeders, but until we get my whole argument about fillies not being able to have more than one kid a month was it's going to take us 2 years or more to find out with any sort of sample size whether those horses have some sort of marginal edge, right? So you can think you're seeing something. There are plenty of legendary broodmares out there that have 3 out of 5 good kids, or started with 3 out of 3 class 3 plus 10% winners, but that doesn't mean that that's going to continue. So it's weighing the weighing the probability that it'll continue, weighing the chance that that their next kid will be good with the cost of that kid or the cost of that breed. It's just we're trying to present factors that you can use to evaluate the value of horses, evaluate the risk you want to take, the gamble you want to make.
The one good thing about the covers bug is that it gave us some parents with tons of kids, and that's nice for data purposes.
Right. Yep. Right. So, Goomba, I wanted to call out one thing. Just because there isn't complexity in the breeding formula, that doesn't mean that it's just about the base ability. There's still that element of variance that each individual kid can have, right? And there's no evidence that again, variance is passed. So, you have a random chance with every kid that you're going to have a great horse, but that variance will be on top of whatever the horse's base ability is. Alpha, I think, do we want to address this? I know we've talked a little bit about it, quantity versus quality. I think we are generally in that camp. But, just because a breeder or a horse hasn't had a good kid in its first 30 kids doesn't mean that it's going to pop out a super horse at some point, right? So, but do we want to talk a little bit more about bloodlines? BG, I know you mentioned that there's no real evidence of a genetic or more complex genetic algorithm.
Well, I mean, it's also interesting to get into the real definition of a genetic algorithm, right? It's one that defines genotypes and phenotypes and a crossover function, and then also the possibility of mutations. So I don't think we have that yet, based on what Jeff has said. It's funny because ZG was the one that ran that Twitter Spaces convo, and he took the exact opposite interpretation, right? So, so you know, two different people
take what we're
come to
saying
two
with a grain
different
of salt,
conclusions.
right?
Yeah. But yeah, I think right now it's simple. Alpha's question is interesting though, because I think you should just because in this kind of model, right, there's maybe one thing you can control, which is where you end up in the class hierarchy. Where do you want to end up, right? A lot of people are like, well, I want to be at the top of class 1 and have a monster, right? I mean, in that case, you should breed with low Z, high performing horses. And I think you still need the quantity, though. Is what we're really saying?
What we're trying to say.
Yeah, like you may end up with a horse that ends in class 1 and loses a lot, right? That part is still, you're going to need some quantity. But if that's your goal, that's what I would do. Is I would find high performing class 1 horses I could breed with cheaply and breed more than one.
Yeah, and I think too, maybe it's just for me, is that if you're looking at, say, like a bloodline in the current ecosystem and with the current, say, like I would call it like a breeding formula more than an algorithm, because it doesn't seem like there's much of an algorithm there. I would look at a bloodline as just the amount of base ability that you can potentially pass on, right? Because like if you're looking at say like you're like a grandchild of Breathless Edge, like that doesn't mean anything if every time you've like Breathless Edge has bred with something, it's dropped 10% of its base ability. Because what you're going to end up with is like, say, an exclusive or an elite or whatever that is like 30 or 40% lower base ability than whatever its parent, like its great grandparents are, right? Like I think when people look at like bloodline, they look at like, oh, maybe there's a chance that whatever gives Breathless Edge its edge, so to speak, then it could potentially show up somewhere later down the line. And that's true in the sense that, like, let's just say you're breeding Breathless Edge with a Z1 and they get 0 drop, then the next time they get 0 drop, and so on and so forth. You could have technically a line of really strong base ability horses. And that, like, I mean, you could look at like that as a bloodline, in my opinion.
Right.
But the G-race results don't mean anything. Like, I don't understand why you always like bring that up as a measure of success in breeding, because the thing is, like, you have a much higher quality of horse, and you're putting them into Griffey races against horses that are largely like Buterins, and like really, so you're like taking 2 class 1 horses, putting them together, and then throwing them into a Griffey with multiple like class 5 horses and so on. So you're going to naturally get like a much lower like base of odds from that.
I think there's you have to grade on a curve for sure. For like, if you put a Z1 in a Griff, of course it's going to have way lower odds, and I think we see that kind of reversion to the mean afterwards, just like we see all the horses that raced against that Z1 in the Griffey, their odds revert lower to their mean when they get to their whatever their kind of normal class position is.
Dragnet, I think that's what we're saying. You have a comment here that about the blood books and kind of how they tie to real life breeding, and I think that's exactly what we're arguing, is that the catch up work is potentially developing that more complex algorithm, or that rather than it being a little bit more formulaic, which is what we think it is now. And I think every indication, like BG was saying, I haven't listened to the Twitter Spaces, but it's there's every indication that ZED is giving is that they're looking at kind of bolstering the model and adding on and continuing to build it out and make things more complex. But in order to do that, they have to make sure that everything that they're doing now works correctly. And I think we are getting to that point, especially with this rollout that they're planning for on Friday, with the fees, correcting the fees, and kind of hopefully stratifying the market a little bit more.
I think Dan's point about telling people it's random ruining the game is important to dive into a little bit,
Yeah.
because it's not entirely random, right? Like I would not argue against Dan's theories that it matters who you breed with, right? It does. I think it's less complicated than people currently imagine it to be. That's really my only point. And I think it will get more complicated over time, as Jeff said the other day. They want to take another pass at the breeding algorithm.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and like I said before, I'm not saying it's completely random. I'm saying that your racing ability in the current environment is largely random. Sorry, racing ability and base ability should be separate. Your performance in the current race environment is largely random because you're relying almost entirely on whatever variance or different distance preference you get when you breed your foal.
Cheat to Win, interesting name. I don't think it's a matter of having balls. I mean, the rollout that they hinted today was they literally had to rewrite the smart contract and roll that back out. And for those of us who were around back in April, there was a very tedious process of rolling out breeding onto the Polygon platform, the Matic Polygon platform, so that it could be gasless. And so, I want to give, I've complained from day one about the fees. I want to give Zed some credit here that assuming things work Saturday going forward, how they have been working, the last month with just the correct fees, I think things are a little more complicated than we give them credit for sometimes. And, I feel like the reason that it's taken so long is because they've had to do a lot of work to make sure it works correctly, and then they'll roll it out and everything will be kind of what it needs to be going forward.
Yeah. Anything that requires a smart contract change, especially if it's not trivial, has to go through a thorough security review. So they've engaged QuantStamp to do their kind of security audits on these contracts. And I am certain that this change had to go through that process as well. So it's like we just saw an almost a good portion of $1 billion hack the other day in a totally unrelated DeFi project.
Right.
I would like to keep my horses and my ETH.
I'd rather give them an extra month or two to make sure everything's secure and we don't suffer a similar fate to some of the other projects that we've heard, especially contract related. So, and Cheat to Win, again, to your point about the legendary market, I think there is an element of that the fees, that there isn't as much stratification in the market as we would like to see. But I think the other piece of that is that like 60 to 70% of the bred horse market right now is legendaries. So just from a simple supply standpoint, if we're looking at supply demand, people aren't necessarily going to be looking at legendary and exclusive females, for example, as drastically different horses. And so when you're looking at price floors and when you're looking at average prices, that supply of legendaries is generally going to drive the market down. And the one thing I will criticize is there's not that much of a difference between the price of breeding with the Genesis, or the premium you pay for breeding with the Genesis, and the price you pay for breeding with a legendary. So there's not, while we're going to see more exclusives and more elites enter the ecosystem as we have more and more breeding cycles, unless there's a change in the gap between Genesis and legendary, you're going to see people continuing to breed Genesis with Genesis and creating more legendaries. And while, again, the exclusive and elite population will grow, supply will grow, you should start to see some of those floors drop a little bit because the supply will grow. That's the reason you've seen the legendary market where it is, where in some cases legendary colts are actually cheaper than exclusive colts. So I don't necessarily understand. What I'm saying is the only real reason you can explain that, or way you can explain that, is the oversupply of legendary colts. I think that was going to happen no matter what. So that's kind of where we are with that. So, sorry, I'm just catching up on chat. I've been rambling a little bit. CJ, BG, did you guys have any comments there?
All I was gonna say is maybe we should try and get to the ZED combination chart before really opening up to like questions, and then like we can also at that point allow people to ask BG questions if they want to see specific data. I just think the Z combination chart is really nice to look at because you'll kind of see is kind of the influence of the current racing environment on breeding combinations, because you're going to have a much smaller percentage of very high base ability horses if they're breeding with each other with profitable racers in the current environment because of the competition level and their inability to, say, class hop. But then you'll look at breeding, say, like a high class horse down with, say, like a Buterin or a Finney, and those combinations are going to yield a little bit more success in terms of profitability in the current environment because they don't have the same level of competition to compete with.
Yep. So one thing I wanted to call out, again, we've talked about this a little bit with some of the other things in the stream, but obviously past performance doesn't mean future performance. So, you're seeing some higher percentages here. And that doesn't mean that those percentages will continue, because if you'll notice, a lot of the higher percentages are in places where you have a much lower total population or number of race population. And so you would expect, as those numbers grow, for the numbers, the percentages to normalize. That said, there are some numbers here that will pop out as we kind of walk through it. And so where I wanted to start was explaining exactly what this chart represents. What this chart represents is all legendaries as of last week. So we've got about 73,000 horses in this data set. And so the count column represents all horses within those 73,000 horses that have greater than 30 paid races, lower than 12 odds, which there's some debate on what a break-even horse looks like, but we erred on the side of including a few more horses in this data set, and greater than 10% win percentage. And where we started was with that greater than 10% caveat, and we've kind of continued to refine this data to get to where we are. And the only other key piece of information here is the count is only horses that have raced at least one paid race in class 3 or above. So what you'll see is that the Buterin numbers will be lower. There are still going to be horses that pool less than 12 odds and are 10% winners in class 5. But we're trying to isolate what most people would consider kind of quote unquote the best racers, the horses that can compete in class 3, class 2 and above. And so in that was what this data set is supposed to represent. Again, it's only legendaries because it gets a good bit more complicated when you get below that with all the different combinations that can go into exclusives and elites. So just kind of looking at what we've been talking about, there are obviously a couple combinations here that stand out, but if you're looking at your Z2 through Z4 legendaries, you do see some lower percentages at the top. And because to CJ's point, you have to remember that when you're looking at where those horses enter, they are all entering the high end of class 3 at a minimum, if not pulling good Griffey odds and then entering class 2 immediately. And so those horses have to compete from the get-go with these class 3 plus horses that we're trying to identify. And then so you see a few combinations that again are a little bit more successful, but In both cases here, Z1 mother into, so let me take a step back. When we look at this genotype column, the gray bars are the genotypes of the offspring, the Z numbers of the offspring. And then the combinations are father on the left, mother on the right. So genotype of the mother into the father, and that's how you get your combination. And before I start talking about some of the percentages, I'm going to try to catch up on chat a little bit. Mumu, no, this isn't assuming that legendaries are supposed to be better racers than their parents, or good racers in general. It's just the largest bred horse data set that we have that we can really kind of dig into with any sort of granularity. Again, because exclusives, there are so many different combinations and so many different ways to get to your different Z numbers. It's really hard to kind of find a middle level of the data where you can look into that. I think the next step will be looking at kind of how bloodlines connect, or how bloodlines combine, and how that might look as far as exclusives go. But when you're talking about parent combinations, really the only data where you have a decent sample size is at the legendary level. I guess, guys, I've been talking a little bit. CJ or BG, do you guys have anything else to say before I jump into kind of some more specific observations?
Go for it.
No, okay. So again, if you look at the top of the pyramid, you do see some higher numbers pop out. Z1 mothers into Z2 fathers, Z3 mothers into Z1 fathers. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean those combinations will continue into the future, and you'll see that those specific combinations have significantly lower sample size than the Z1s into Z1s, Z2s into Z1s, and Z2s into Z2s. The opposite, or the same, however you're looking at it, is true for the other Zabo legendary Z1 into Z3. Yeah, there haven't been any that fit our criteria that have been bred with a Z3 father. That doesn't mean that won't quickly catch up. Even if two of the next three are good racers, sub 12 odds in class 4, class 3 and above, those percentages start to even out very quickly. So just wanted to point that out again. And so, I'm going to kind of scroll down so you guys can see, but you see some lower percentages here. Again, we believe because of the average starting class and the odds that those horses, or the competition that those horses are facing out of the gate. Once you break below into Z5 and below, you start in class 4. You see slightly higher percentages there than some of your Nakamoto and Zabo legendaries. And then, when you're talking about your Z10s, your Z11s, you start to see some of your Buterin combinations come in, and you see some pretty interesting numbers, right? And I think I don't know if MJ is still watching, but to his question a lot earlier in the stream, I think there is some argument that because these horses are entering in class 4 or even class 5, that there is even, so the one thing I wanted to point out again is that you have a kind of smaller sample size here, but there is some element of mashing breeds together and starting in a lower class and potentially having a better chance at getting better odds and better win percent in your lower classes. That doesn't mean those horses will be competitive and as competitive in class 3 and above. But it does mean, because of how these numbers were calculated, that there are, let's look at 11 Z2 plus Z8 mothers into Z2s that have won at least class one race, or run at least one class 3 race, and have a better than 10% win percentage in their career in paid races. So those are pretty good numbers. 11 out of 87 that have ever raced, or 103 total. So there are 16 here that haven't been raced. And you see some similar percentages there when you're looking at some of your butyrins into your, higher or lower Zs, however you look at it. And then as you scroll down into your butyrins into finnies and your butyrins into butyrins, there, again, the importance of some of these breeding fee changes, you have a very noticeably lower strike rate. But, if you're comparing a butyrin into a butyrin versus a butyrin into a Nakamoto with the fee structure change, or correction, butyrin into butyrin is 1/4 the cost of your minimum Nakamoto stud. And so even though you're hitting at a much lower percentage, you can afford a few more breeds to try to hit on, a competitive racer. Alpha. I mean, I think it's important to call out that it's a good question. The data so far suggests that, eights do have a pretty good success rate. 8s and 9s, and some 10s have a pretty good success rate breeding into Zabos and butyrins. And they, over the sample of 30 races, they're a little bit more competitive, or there's a slightly higher percentage of those horses being competitive. But again, you have to weigh that with the cost of those studs versus the expected performance. Even at the very top end here, you're seeing like a 12.6%, right? So 1 out of 8 or less, right around 1 out of 8 horses of this specific combination are turning out to be, 10% winners with less than 12 odds. That's still only 1 out of 8, right? And if you're paying even the minimum Nakamoto stud at this point, which is what it was intended to be, 0.135, you're paying an ETH for every good racer that you get, just to do the quick math there, a little over an ETH.
So and just one other kind of like side point to what Alpha is saying. This is kind of like a general look at ZED combinations. Mm-hmm. You also have to remember that each individual horse is going to have a different base ability. So while, say, like most Z8s will fall within a specific range, you are still going to have some that have a lower base ability and some that have a higher base ability that will give you different results, right? So it's not as simple as just being like Z8 plus Z2 equals this. It's like your specific Z8 with a specific Z2 could equal this, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good call out. And so I think I've kind of walked through my piece and kind of showed the chart. I think the other thing that I can show here is, let me pull this down and come back to it. Give me 1 second. So again, just as kind of a summary view, looking at different combinations of bloodline moms and dads, you'll notice some have very small sample sizes. You have very few Nakamoto mothers being bred with lower Z dads or Z5s and below. And then, but you see the stair step here that you would kind of expect to see of you Dragnet, where I think there's a little bit of an inside joke there about who's the face of the stream, but I think we're gonna leave that one alone tonight. So I think that the last thing that we wanted to leave you guys with this file is, hey, we flipped through some of the specific combinations, but if you look at it on a bloodline basis, you see a little bit of a stair step here that you would expect to see, where you do have kind of higher percentages with, your better horses breeding with better horses, and the one that doesn't really fit that mold is Nakamoto's and the Nakamoto's, again, because of where they're starting in the class structure. So with that, CJ, BG, unless you guys had anything else you wanted to say on the topic, I think we were going to open it up to questions. And I know we've answered a lot of questions as we've gone, and we're happy to see the stream be kind of as interactive. The stream be as interactive. You guys have had a lot of good questions tonight, a lot of good conversation. So really, really appreciate the interactivity tonight.
I did want to address just one comment before we move more into into what BG was gonna pull up and start with his data analysis or whatever people had questions for him if they wanted specific data. Just in more to Dan Shan's point of the question of why would C8 and CX be better than C8 and CY, and I think I kind of addressed this already in the sense that like this is just like a general overview of why that would be successful. And BG already showed that with his chart in terms of like there is a natural hierarchy to the Z number. Yeah, absolutely, crypto. There is a natural hierarchy to like the Z numbers of the Genesis, right? So like it shows that generally speaking, Z1 will have the highest base ability, Z2 will be next, Z3, and so on and so forth. Now, that all falls on like a spectrum, right? Like you still will have some Z8 to Z10 horses that could potentially, I believe, I didn't look closely at the chart, but could potentially have, say, like a higher base ability than maybe the weakest Z1, right? So like you're still looking at it on like a spectrum, but like it just gives you a general idea of like, let's just say you wanted to go out there and you're looking at specific breeding combinations that might work for you, or you wanted to analyze your horse versus another. Like this just gives you a guide more than you still have to look in more detail about what it is exactly that you're breeding.
So BG, do you want me to pull up the chart that you're looking at here?
Oh yeah. If you want to share that, because I think it kind of speaks directly to what you were just showing. So I just ran this, which I had not looked at before. But this is on the one axis. This is the average of the generations from Genesis of the mother and father. So how many times the mother or father has been bred since the Genesis horse that was the grandparent, for example. Mm-hmm. And the distribution of where its foals end up. Yeah. So it's really stark, right? Like if you're an average of 6 generations from Genesis, you're way down here in class 5. And if you're 2 generations from Genesis, then you are you can make it into class 1, like top of class 1. So like whoever this dot is over here is one of the best horses in the game. But it doesn't guarantee you, right? Because a bunch of them end up at the bottom of class 5 too. And so that's kind of where quantity comes into play, I think. Mm-hmm. And as CryptDog said, you got to feed your horses. But it
How
is.
Are they
it's
supposed to run otherwise?
It's such a stark line. I had not looked at it this way before, and I'm always kind of surprised when things like this show up in the data. Right, like the further you get from Genesis, it it may have some kind of cap on where you can end up in terms of the average class that you're racing in. Here's a little outlier. So you can exceed it, but
that's probably White Racer. No, seriously.
Well, I mean, I think that this makes sense, right? Like in terms of like Genesis horses, I feel like need to have a certain tuning in order to stay relevant in the racing environment, because eventually, let's just say a year, 2 years, 3 years from now, you're going to have such a huge sample size potentially of bred horses from the legendary level, from the exclusive level, from the elite level, that just by like the law of having a large sample size, you're going to get like enough outliers that they can overthrow the Genesis, so to speak, right? Like, wouldn't this speak to that in terms of like, you will have those outliers and eventually you have enough outliers just by like purely large numbers, right?
Yeah, I think so. Like we've already exceeded the number, the number of bred horses already exceeds the number of Genesis horses there will ever be.
There ever will be.
Yeah.
And that's just going to keep growing exponentially, right?
Yep.
Well, there's some debate there, but.
Oh, in terms of number of bred horses?
No, I'm saying
he's saying the exponential
piece.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah. So to speak to that, here's breeds per day, new foals per day. So you can see we hit a little bit of a low mark on the 14th, and it's creeping up again. And then if you look back to the 20th and the 21st, we're about to see all these become eligible to breed for the first time, I think. So might see another little spike.
Little blip,
But I think that was an artificial spike, right? Because that was also when they reset all the breeds.
Yeah.
So everyone was able to get another free breed in.
Right,
Plus, it was close. It was also close to the reset time already. So I think there was like the potential for 3 breeds in a very short period,
but
right?
all of these kids are about to be eligible.
Right.
Yeah. So the parents may not be, but the children are.
Actually, I think that they start being eligible today, don't they? Is that the 20th?
It's the 20th. I always forget how UTC works, but
because I just bred a horse that was bred on the 20th.
Nice. So when I run this data is like 2-3 hours old now, so be curious. So this is actually a partial day's worth of data. So this likely goes up a bit before the day's over.
Right.
All right, sweet. What do we want to look at? So I have every race ever ran, every entry for every race, every sale that's ever been made on OpenSea for Zed, and then all the the 600 stats for every horse. So if people have questions, now's the time.
I think the stats are showing this way. Right, Mumu. I think that's right. I think there has been a lot. If you look at the quote unquote percentage of successful horses, it's definitely growing as a percentage of the recent bred horses. But there was a while in there where you weren't seeing a lot of success, especially in kind of June through July. There wasn't a lot of a lot of the top horses you were seeing get into the mix, but there definitely was a lot more random breeding. There was a lot of breed sniping with random horses, and not necessarily kind of the calculated breeding that we're starting to see. So I think that's a good call out. So I don't know, CJ or BG, where do we want to go next? I mean, do you have more data that you want to kind of want to walk through, or do you want to?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, what I just pulled up was some kind of
which
market.
horse is the best?
With some market analysis of what's happening on OpenSea, which I think is really interesting. So this is looking at all the Z10s since June. All female Z10s, and then priced in USD. So you can see things start to pick up recently, right? And then if you look at price in ETH, it's kind of a different pattern. you see people really get married to this to certain amounts, right? So all these at 0.5, yeah. But in terms of USD, people eventually kind of figure out like, oh yeah, things like ETH is not going down, prices are also not going down, so I'm just going to buy before they get even more expensive. I found the patterns in USD versus ETH can be fairly interesting.
Yeah, no, I think that is an important thing to call out. There's always the debate of how do people price horses. I'm strongly in the regardless of what people say, the market is driven in ETH.
Oops.
That's no problem. And so I strongly believe that. I do think that because of the pretty large fluctuations we've seen in short periods of time, that some of that does get baked in. I'll pull this back up.
Cool.
But usually it's only kind of 10 to 25% of the variance in ETH from a fiat perspective is priced into the horses. So if ETH doubles, you're still only going to see prices maybe drop 10 to 20 to maybe 25% in ETH. You're not going to see a proportional change. And that's the same thing we saw in May when ETH dropped a lot. You did see prices go up a little bit, but not nearly the 50% drop in ETH. You saw prices creep up 10 or 20%, and that to your point about Z10s remaining fairly consistent, I think there are certain Zs that you probably see a little bit more of an upward trend in ETH, like your Nakamoto's.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is that in ETH? Yeah.
That's USD. Let me look at the ETH price. Yeah, very similar, right?
Yeah. So your Nakamoto's, you're seeing, ETH has doubled in the last month, but Z1 prices have also close to doubled or more in ETH. So there's no, there's no kind of correlation to fiat prices there. But I do think you have some flex in legendaries and bred horses. I do think you have some flex in the lower Zs. But again, you only see some of that pass through into your ETH prices as people are, comfortable, capturing their profits slightly lower ETH because they know they're going to get more dollars or euro or Canadian dollars or whatever out of it. So
cool. What else do people want to see?
Dan, I would say that they're 80 to 90%. I mean, they're 80 to 90% independent of fiat. So the market is in ETH. People price horses in ETH, and the fluctuations are more ETH based than fiat based. But there is a little bit of USD flex in there.
Yeah, as Mumu just said too, the breeding is in ETH, and so that people want a certain amount of ETH profit.
Exactly. That's a really good point.
So BG, Mumu wants to see a charting of Z9 Buterin legendaries down to Z20s and where they fall on the average class or the mean class hierarchy.
Okay.
Are you able to pull that up? And in the meantime, I'll just kind of answer Dragnet. In terms of introducing NAC or Zabo blood, I guess it really kind of depends on the horse that you're breeding with. But generally speaking, if you can add NAC or Zabo blood, I mean, again, it depends on what outcome you're looking for. But if you're looking for a higher base ability, then you're generally going to have a better chance of getting a higher base ability by breeding with a Nakamoto or with a Zabo than you will with another Buterin. And then the variance and distance preference are always going to be random.
All right, can you set up that filter for me again?
Sorry, you want to know what it is? It's Z9 to Z20 legendary Buterins.
Okay, legendary Buterin.
NAC Jenny or NAC Legend or NAC. What do you mean by that, MJ? Sorry.
Okay, so this is the
No
distribution
problem.
for all Z9 through Z20 legendary Buterans with at least 50 races. Highest is average around 1.8. So lots of class 2 and a little bit of class 1, and then the majority down in class 4 and 5.
So sorry, I'll go back to what you're saying, BG. I just wanted to answer MJ real quick. This is importance of being like breeding with them. It's really just going to come down to this specific horse, but you're going to have a higher chance of a higher base ability coming from a Genesis Nakamoto than you will from, say, an exclusive or legendary, just because most of the data supports that there's at least there's somewhere between a 0 and 10% drop in base ability from each breed. So, or like each time you breed two horses. So, I mean, like you could in theory have a legendary Nakamoto that has the same base ability as its parents, which is on the high end of the result from breeding. But most of the time you're going to have some kind of drop. And then if you're going to exclusive, you're going to have an even further drop most of the time. Yep. So in theory, if the Nakamoto Genesis is available and you think that it's a high base ability one, that's where you would want to go, because then you also know that it's not being watered down through breeding. Right. But again, it's always going to be like on an individual horse basis, right? Like you can, in theory, if you hit the lottery, you could end up with a Nakamoto Elite that has the same or higher. Well, I mean, I think it's possible to have higher base ability from as like a ZED or a Nakamoto Genesis. It's just that the likelihood of that happening is very small. And that's why I love, we, at least as a group, are very much in the race your horses camp. You can't really derive a lot of information from an unraced horse. It's just, you can't get any information from it, right? It's like even looking at its offspring, you're going to have a very hard time without like an extremely large sample size. And even then, determining what the base ability of an unraced horse is. So, I don't like breeding with unraced horses. But yeah, anyway, so just to answer your question, in theory, if you want the most likely higher base ability, you're going to want to start at the Genesis level and move down, because it's you're going to have the highest starting base ability.
One caveat there, though, is if one parent is significantly better than the other, then you could have a legendary horse that has higher ability than one of the Genesis. So if the mother is significantly better than the father, then that legendary horse could have a base ability somewhere in between them, right? Or much closer to the mother's ability. And therefore you could argue that you'd want to stud with the legendary rather than the Genesis father. That who knows how often that happens. I think we'd argue that it doesn't happen that often, but you will have cases where that, that would work out. So same thing with exclusives. If you have a really strong legendary breeding with a really strong Genesis, there's a chance that breeding with that offspring could be better than breeding somewhere else up in, above it in the chain with a weaker parent or grandparent. So
yeah, absolutely. And that's where it comes down to, like, you need to kind of like look at each individual horse that you're breeding with, rather than just looking at it as like, it's like when we pulled up that chart of the general Z numbers being bred into each other, it's more of just like a guideline of, because generally speaking, it follows a hierarchy of class from Z1 down to Z10, but you still do need to kind of like really dive into the horses that you're breeding with, unless you're just trying to snipe a quick Nakamoto Genesis that's listed for cheap, right?
Right. BG, I think one question, one kind of follow on to Mumu's question about the Z9s through Z20s. Do you have this chart in the histogram format that you were looking at before with the 25 to 75 percentile? I think that might be interesting.
So I can show you those if we're comparing against something else. So like if you want to see against the parent average class mean, I can show you that. But to get the histogram, I have to compare two different variables.
Got it.
Whereas this or sorry, this is like the box and whisker chart. And so this histogram is just the distribution of that specific variable.
Are you not able to separate the variables by Z number?
That's what I thought the one we were looking at before was
okay, gotcha.
Z number versus average.
So
cloud.
he wants to see like the
so
average distribution, like by separating the Z numbers from all the butane legendaries.
I gotcha.
And also after that, it would be nice to address Gag's question while you're kind of setting that up. It hasn't. I don't know if it's really been touched on that much, but he wants to know if like when we're talking about putting money into ZED, are we investing really in the future of ZED, or are we investing in the future of ETH?
Yeah, I think to some extent you are, unless you take profit consistently. If you're holding all of that money in ZED continuously, and you are paying, as ETH goes up, you're paying higher premiums to breed and to race, then yeah, you are investing in the future price of ETH. So like with anything involved in crypto, I would advocate for taking profit if you have made any every so often.
Yeah, I learned that in 2017, unfortunately.
I think it's a combination. When I first joined, I was tracking everything in fiat. I still do to a large extent. But I was tracking everything in fiat, and I was saying that the currency risk was multiplicative on the token risk, right? The value of the horses and the value of the currency kind of add together to look at your total risk here. I think kind of related to what we were talking about before, the market isn't that responsive to fiat. It's relatively inelastic when we're looking at kind of the fiat impact. So to some extent, you actually kind of have a hedge against ETH cratering, because as long as the subset of the NFT market that we're in doesn't go away, then your ETH value of your horses could remain, right? So you kind of have a hedge against ETH falling. That said, to BG's point, taking profit is always a good thing. Continuing to leg in on the way up is, if you put money into GameStop, or if you put money into something else, or like CJ talked about a few years ago, if you buy on the way up and don't take profit, then you can get burned no matter what. So
and just to clarify that point, it was more that like if you're putting money into something that you see future value in, and the value starts pumping, it's really easy to get caught up in that idea that like, wow, it's going up, so it's just going to keep going up forever. Right. And like that was my first investment in crypto, was like I got in right before the big pump in 2017. So I was like, oh, this sounds really cool. I'm going to put some like money in. And it's like not life-changing money, but enough where it was like I was up like a lot at one point. But I was like, oh, well, it's just going to keep going up, right? So eventually then it started coming down, and then because of the way it was set up in 2017 versus now, it was really difficult, at least in Canada, to get money back off the exchanges. So I just kind of like almost went back down to like what I put in the first place. Yeah. So, and it's one of those things where it's like, I didn't really like lose money, but I lost potential money, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
And something someone said to me once, which really stuck with me at work, because I was sitting with him and I was all happy. And I was like, oh yeah, I just made like $3,000 today. And he's like, oh really? Like you sold? And I was like, well, no, like it went up $3,000. He's like, oh, well then you haven't made any money yet. And I was like, oh, what do you mean? He's like, well, you don't make any money until you take it out, or like, and you don't lose any money until you take it out. Right. So, yeah, anyway, that's just kind of like my little story.
Yeah, no, I've done that twice in recent memory. I did a bunch of security audits for Augur, and they paid me in Augur rep. And then I paid taxes on the value at the time. And then it went up to like 20x that before Augur had even launched, right? I was like, I'm going to wait till they launch, because then it'll really go up. And then it launched and it went way down. So I got out at the value that I paid taxes at. So it was fine. And then Top Shot I was up quite a bit on Top Shot, and it went way down as well. So got to take profit.
Yep.
Mumu had asked about seeing that same chart by win rate, and you see there's much less correlation. According to our handy R squared over here, there's actually no correlation, or rather, the medians, they don't look equal, but statistically you can see they're equal medians.
And that's showing the different Buterin legendary combinations, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Same thing we were looking at by class mean, and now we're looking at by win rate.
Yeah. If you see BG starting to sell in Zed, you know it's time to. No, I'm just kidding.
that's the real reason that.
That's like track is.
I learned my lesson with Zed. I've been taking profit for sure. Yeah.
Exactly.
We're just kidding, by the way. I am extremely bullish on Zed. I will.
Yeah, I everything I've seen so far, like, sure, there's been missteps, right? Like early on, I was kind of comparing some of it to what happened with Top Shot, right? But I feel like this team has been a little more agile, has been very responsive. It's crypto, right? So it's the Wild West, and everybody's kind of making it up as they go along. But I'm pretty bullish on Zed still.
Hey, BG, one question that popped up. Can you remind chat what tool you're using here?
Yeah,
I think there was a question about what tool.
Yeah, this is called Wizard. It is Mac only, but it is friggin' amazing and saves me so much time. If you're on Windows, the closest equivalent is probably RStudio, and it's a little harder to use. Wizard is all about, like, you point and click, and you have your rigorous statistical analysis. So that's my secret weapon in making all these charts real quick. So you can see if I right click here, I get copy image to clipboard, and then I just paste those into Discord. So yeah, that's how I'm so fast.
Yeah. Well, it helps that you've built out the back end of 600 different variables. And
that's what took me 300 hours.
Code, right?
Yeah. That's what I spent all the time on. But so CryptDog provides CSVs on the ZOD sites. So like you can drop those CSVs directly into Wizard if you're on a Mac. You could also drop them directly into RStudio on Windows. RStudio is free. Wizard, I think, is $100. Worth every penny though. So.
And that's something I remember you recommended to me early on when I first met you over in Step, was to learn R and go check out the RStudio. I am slowly doing that, but you know what? There's not really a huge incentive for me to do so when I can just rely on you so much. So, I mean,
I'm happy to share. I'm actually learning R a little bit too. There's a advanced statistics course on Coursera that Duke University runs. That's all based on R. So I've just been trying to bone up on my kind of statistical theory. It's like I've been a software engineer for like how old am I? 21, 22 years now. So
you're 21?
No, I've been an engineer for 22 years. Yeah.
Oh wow, that's cool, man.
So it puts a lower bound on how old I can be, I think, depending on labor laws, right?
At least 25.
I don't mind telling you I'm 38.
38, okay.
Yeah. Where was I going with this? I have no idea. I also have crippling ADD, so that's why I spend so much time on Zed and less time than I should on my day job.
Hey, me too. What was I gonna say? No, I forget. Yeah, I forget. I don't know. Oh, the data files. We are going to be opening up our Discord to the public, ideally this week at some point. Hopefully by the end of the week. We've been kind of making some organizational changes there. And in our Discord, we have a whole section dedicated to really good information and links and tools. So we do have the crypto G dump. I don't know why I would call it that. The data dump linked in there. We have all kinds of tools, like shout out to MJ Stables. He has a really cool analytical tool. I believe he calls Zedalytics. Is that what it's called? I have the link saved somewhere. That it really helps you analyze your horse in different ways. I was using something different before that, but it's really easy to use, really intuitive, and shows you a lot of information that helps you dig deep into horses. There's this standard like know your horses, gives you a lot of information, and I use that for more like more specific analysis, like going like deeper into the horse rather than just like generally looking at their surface. There's obviously you have Haku, which is the best market tool out there, and it's really quickly rising to be one of the best analysis tools as well. I probably spend more time on Haku than I do on a lot of other things that I should be spending time on. But yeah, I mean, there's so many good tools, and there's so many good people out in the community in ZED right now. It's really cool to see how quickly it's expanding, and I think in a general sense, like how much those people really like to help each other out and help grow the community in general. So yeah, I don't know where that really came from, but let's move on to someone else.
No, we were talking about the data and the tools. I dropped the link that CJ mentioned to CryptoG zip files that he updates daily.
I think it's Cryptog, short for cryptographer.
Cryptog. Okay. I don't know if he's still around. I've always called him Crypto D.
I like to think of it that he's like a crypto gangster.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So I dropped that link. You have a zip file of the full horse database that gets updated daily, which includes kind of all your information on the ZED Run horse page except for offspring, and then you have a full race database that you can access, but because of how many races have been run, you actually can't access the odds information in a single Excel file anymore. So you have to use a tool like our studios that we're talking about, or to actually pull the data and manipulate it, or Python to manually combine Excel files into kind of a usable format. So, but that said, the data's there. Really appreciate Cryptog or CryptoG, I don't know how he says it, for putting that together. I know it's been up for a few months, and it is really helpful to have that out there. So Souls Vanish, we don't have a link to the Discord yet, but because we just started streaming, we're going to get some commands set up and get the Discord linked as soon as it's ready to be opened. And we said this week, last week, and I think we're still on target to hit this week. So, appreciate you guys having interest in that. And like CJ said, we'll have some of these tools links, some of this information, some snapshots, and some links in there that will be helpful. So, that's that. I've said my piece. BG, do you want to jump in and say something else? Anything else to add at this point?
No, I would just say I'm in most, if not all, of the ZED Discords at this point. So if you got questions, always hit me up. Always happy to answer if I know the answer. BG, and then the 4 numbers are 3333 on Discord. So that's the best place to reach me. And then MJ, I'm going to hit you on Discord because I got some stats questions for you. I've been meaning to reach out once I saw your tool. And then the one other tool that I feel like gets lost sometimes in these kind of lists of tools is ZedRun.tools, which has been making a ton of updates recently. So it's a
really good site, and I actually think that it has the best ancestry tool in terms of being able to map out the breeding tree. I mean, as someone who doesn't really believe in bloodlines, I don't know how useful I really find it in terms of like being able to determine ability, but I still think it's a cool feature to have. And it's definitely the best one to look at. Yeah. And the only caveat I would say with in terms of reaching out to BG, you just can't really ask him too many data questions when he's busy pulling data for us.
well, luckily all the time investment I've made into the pipeline makes it super quick to answer most things. So always happy.
Yeah, I'm totally joking about that.
BG, appreciate you calling out ZedRun.tools. We often kind of gloss over it because we focus on racing on prior streams, but because this is a breeding stream, it's a great tool to call out. If you look at a horse, the way it works is if you just go to zedrun.tools and then you click on the lineage button for any horse, or you can search for the horse up at the top. You can then drill down into literally, every child that horse has ever had, see a snapshot of a summary snapshot of the horse stats. The one thing to caution there is this does include free races, so that to the extent that you like to look at paid races only, you would need to then kind of put the kids into Know Your Horse or Haku to sort that out. But to BG's point, you can literally build a family tree very quickly. Looking down several generations. So, kind of looking at different horses and different combinations to see if you can identify things there. I agree. I used to live on this tool. I still access it every day. But really, really good shout out there. So
the other thing I'll say about Bloodlines is that in real life horse racing, there's this metric called average earnings index. So I implemented a version of that for ZED, and have not found correlation yet, though in ZED, I think it is a little trickier to kind of map that metric to ZED ponies. So if people have thoughts there, I would love to hear them on how to improve that type of analysis, because I think it's worth looking at breeding theories that include blood or purity or any of those type of things still.
Right.
Just because we haven't found evidence yet doesn't mean
there's a large element there of human interference.
Yes.
Too, right. So if you're not if every trainer was racing their horses relatively efficiency, you might see different stats or different earnings than you currently do. There are some horses that outperform their ability and their odds, and there are some horses that aren't run as optimally. And so I think that impacts it too. But to your point, as the ecosystem builds out and as there's more information, you could start to see things normalize, right? So yeah,
that mismanagement or not always mismanagement, but an attribute per horse for how well it's been raced is something I've been working on as well. So I calculate ELO scores, and I calculate a mean ELO for the field for every race. And so looking at, on average, if you're entering your horse into fields that are more competitive or less competitive, may be an indicator of how you're managing that horse's racing. Right. So I'm not sure if that's going to be the metric, but that was my early attempt at it.
Yeah. Yeah, Mumu, to your point about time, I think that's right. I mean, it's the data and the bloodlines will unfold over time, especially as that continues to develop breeding. My point earlier was I think Cryptog mentioned 30 as a sample size. Well, 30 kids for a foal or a filly takes 2.5 years. So we've only had breeding open for 2 months. We've had a few extra cycles in there. And then we had breeding open in April. But other than that's all the breeding data we're looking at here. So things will be fluid and things will continue to develop as we go. And this was sort of our attempt to dilute some of that down and kind of give you guys presentable data that you can use or choose to use or choose not to use, however you want to proceed forward. But I think CJ mentioned it, that hey, this is kind of what we have, and it's meant to be another kind of feather in your cap or or tool that you can use to think about how to evaluate horses and evaluate breeding.
To Alpha's question really quick, in a vacuum, Griffey odds are kind of meaningless because your odds are always relative to your competition. But I've actually made most of my money in Zed finding really good horses based on their Griffey, buying them for whatever they're listed at, and then racing them and selling them for more. I think that there's an element of gambling when you're doing Griffey analysis because there are so many moving pieces, but you can definitely gain a lot of information from Griffey results based on the races of the other horses in them after the Griffey. So you just have to use it as a relative point of comparison when you're going through race history of other horses in the Griffey. And you can generally get a pretty good idea of how strong the horse is, as long as it's not a spiker, by doing that relative comparison. And again, that also does kind of sort of require you to have a good general knowledge of the racing fields and how strong the horses that you're using as baselines are. But yes, in short, I think that there is a lot of good info in a Griffey that you can use.
And that's also what I meant earlier when I said you have to grade on a curve. So if you're putting, a Z20 into a Griffey and it gets 4 odds, that may be a great horse. Whereas if you're putting a Z1 into a Griffey and it gets 4 odds, you're going to go, oh shit, because you wanted, 2.7 odds or something. Yeah. So that to CJ's point, you can there's information asymmetry there because people will get a Griffey and think it's a bad Griffey and it's actually fairly good odds wise, and then once you race that you find out like, oh yeah, it's actually going to do a little better than the Griffey most people would have assumed. So
the best horse that I have ever had from breeding was actually like the 3rd or 4th best odds in its Griffey and ended up being the best horse in that race. Again, this a lot of this comes down to like racing profiles, distance preference, and like you're saying, base ability plays a big part as well. Because if you have, like you're saying, a Nakamoto that's like either a Genesis or a Legendary in against a whole bunch of Buterins, like you basically want like 1 to 2 odds, or there's a good chance that the horse is not going to be that good.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can talk about certain horses, specific horses tonight as some of the questions. We can also answer any questions. I mean, BG, I don't know how you're doing for time.
I got about 3 minutes left, and I got to jump to.
If you've got to jump off
after that.
I think that would probably be a good time to wrap up for me as well.
Okay.
I didn't actually sleep at all last night, so I kind of need to get my beauty rest.
So I know we've still got a few people still watching us, so I'm happy to stay on for a little while longer, another 20 or 30 minutes to answer questions about specific horses. I know we have a few in chat. I guess given the timing, as far as as far as breeding and general comments about some of the stuff that we've talked about, did you guys have anything else that you wanted to call out before you jump off?
I'll do my best, Jerry Springer, and say be nice to each other or be good to each other, because that's honest. Like I see people like flaming in Zed General, and like that's there's no quicker way to show that you're not friendly to noobs and chase people away than doing that. So I always just try and say we should be nice to the noobs. And then somebody just asked what my Twitter handle is. That is a secret because I'm not. I don't tweet out about anything crypto. I'm going to make an alt for all my Zed stuff, and then y'all can have that.
Yeah, that's a good idea. And yeah, just to kind of echo what BG says, I think that like when I first came into Zed, there were a lot of like the like kind of older guard and kind of some of the bigger stables that I noticed really after my first few weeks that they kind of took advantage a lot of newer players. And to me, that's just like when you have a community this relatively small compared to what Zed wants to accomplish. It's really better for everyone involved if you can help grow that community. And a big part of growing that community is being, being nice. Like it is a simple thing, right? To just like have cordial conversations. Like you can disagree with someone without having to flame them, and like everybody's going to have different ideas of how things work. Not anytime like someone disagrees with you is not an insult or like a shot at you. It's just sometimes people have different ideas, and I think it's good to be open-minded to that, because I think it's important to allow people to challenge what you think, because either you're going to learn more about what you think and become more entrenched in your opinion, or maybe you can learn something and maybe even change your mind. I think one of the biggest things that people do in debates nowadays is that like they go in not looking to hear the other side of the story, but they're just waiting for their opportunity to kind of tell their side and hope. They're just trying to like, and I mean, obviously it's natural to try and convince people. I'm starting to ramble now. I'm too tired. But just like be nice, have fun, like grow the community, because that's good for everybody involved. Yep. And yeah, watch our stream. Wait, did I say that out loud?
That's right.
Yeah. On the topic of being challenged, there was one thing we looked at earlier where we looked at variability by Z level, and we saw a pattern that I didn't expect to see. So that was a little. I definitely made a note to go chase that down.
Dig into that a little more.
Yeah. So I'm gonna go play some poker, and I hope everybody has a good night.
Good luck.
Right, really appreciate you joining us.
Use all your luck tonight.
Yeah. I'm hoping so.
So well, I'm gonna probably bounce too. A big thank you to BG for coming out, because obviously he is incredible with data. I mean, he seems like he's just a really good all around guy. He's really nice to have on the stream. Anybody who wants to stick around for David, he is also extremely intelligent and helpful. So if you have any specific questions about horses or just want to chat with him, he's a good guy to do it with, especially involved in Zed. So I am going to bounce. I'm very tired. Thank you so much to everybody that came out. Thank you to all the new followers and subscriptions. We they're very humbled by the amount of support that we've received so early on in doing this. And our goal long term is just to keep doing this, learning as much as we can about Zed, and then trying to disseminate everything we learn about Zed to everybody else, and hopefully in a positive way. So everybody have a good night. Dave, I'll probably talk to you later, man.
Yeah, man. Sounds good. Thanks.
All right. Bye, guys.
All right. So you've just got me left. Like I said, I know we've got a few people still watching. Humans and Zombies. I remember actually last stream you asked about color breeding data. I remember there being a resource. I need to dig into that, and I will actually. I have a note to actually reach out to you. I'll try to whisper you if I can find that. And then the other thing, we talked a little bit about social media. For Discord, you can search Quest Racing. You'll see it next to my name in Zed General, and then you can shoot me a DM there if you want in Discord. So, and then. Yeah, so I'm happy to stay on for another 20 or 30 minutes. I'm a bit of a night owl. We got started a little bit earlier than usual tonight. I'm probably going to be up past midnight or several more hours playing around with stuff. So, cheat to win. There's not a Discord link yet, but we will, once we're ready to open it, we will put that into our into one of the panels on our channel page, and we'll make sure that everybody can get into that. So it's coming soon. We've been doing some work over the last week to build out some roles. It was a pretty small Discord kind of before we decided to open it up publicly. So yeah, Dragnet. I'm East Coast US, so it's only 10 p.m. here, which again is pretty early for me, but late for a lot of people. So any questions about? I know I answered humans and zombies question about the color data. I need to come back to that. I know there's resources out there. We've talked a little bit about the step stable calculator. You can put any two colors in, and it will give you the percentage chance of getting certain colors, and also the percentage chance of getting a super coat, the same color of the parents, if you're breeding two of the same color together. This is an interesting question. So the data that we were looking at earlier really focused on legendaries only, because there are fewer exclusive and elite horses. We're still working on kind of digesting that data and figuring out what's a large enough sample to present to you guys with any sort of certainty. Again, not that the data that we presented today won't change. And again, the whole caveat was it should be a piece of how you analyze horses. But there's just not enough exclusive and elite data out there right now to really do the same type of breakdown we were looking at. But the goal will be kind of as we move forward, maybe not next week, but within the next couple of weeks, as we get another cycle of breeding or cycle or two of breeding, that we can have another kind of breeding stream to talk about updated data and other things that we're seeing. Yeah, Alpha, that's a good question on racing. I know we've talked about this a little bit, and so one kind of side note, we will do pop-up racing streams. A few of you have kind of found your way to the one that I did a couple weeks ago. We did another one last week where we talked about specific horses. We won't always keep those published, but if you guys can join, we'll kind of denote that they're pop-up racing streams, and on those we'll take specific questions on specific horses about how to race them. I know Dragnet, you reached out separately, and I'll take another look. The horse didn't look like it reacted at 2,400 like I kind of expected it to. So we'll take another look and see what that one looks like. Alpha, to your point about testing new horses, obviously all of this will change when Flames come out, but we have a pretty good idea of what Flames will look like. As far as currently, we still have odds. So my rule of thumb is you race it in whatever Griffey you can get into. If you feel like running it against a more competitive field, you can do that. If you feel like waiting for a less competitive field where there are more, Buter and legendaries and below, you can do that as well. It all depends on what your plan for the horse is. And then as far as figuring out what distance, in my mind, and this differs between me and CJ or me and other people, in my mind, you can run a horse at, 3 or 4 different distances out of the gate, $2.50 races in each, and start to get a feel for the odds of the horse for now and how those compare to the rest of the field. So for me, it's all about placements. It's all about, how the horses compare to the competition. And so that's kind of how I look at it. But I think within 2 or 3 races at each distance, you really start to see, and sometimes even sooner than that. If you run it in 1,600 and it pulls huge odds, then you're going to likely find one of its better distances to be out at the ends. And if you run it at the ends and it, still pulls higher odds, then you might have a donkey horse, or you might be up against an especially strong field. Greeno, good question. So this one we will, we put out a good bit of information here, and sometimes when we kind of share some information, we won't always keep those VODs public. That said, this one we definitely will. Our kind of normal weekly stream, we'll do what we can to keep those published for as long as we can. I think we're limited to 2 weeks, but at this point, but you should be able to watch this one after the fact. Gutters. Again, nothing on the stream is financial advice. My personal favorite is getting up into the Nakamoto blood, but I think you can find valuable horses at any bloodline. I think price point Zabo and Finney legendaries, there are good values out there. Buterins, you can even find pretty good values. Nakamoto's, you're not going to find as good a value unless you're, investing in kind of a high odds Z2 Colt. But again, I think market data wise, you can use Haku to really look at. And your question was about female. So the market data wise, you can kind of look at Z number and value and racing ability and how that all kind of balances. Female, I think you can make the argument that exclusives do hold value because you're able to breed into Genesis and still have an exclusive. So the flip side of that is if you are breeding with legendaries in your own stable or looking at legendaries with high ability, obviously you'll lose a level if you go exclusive and you'll end up with an elite horse. So that's the debate you kind of have to have between value of an exclusive and value of a legendary. And you will see a little bit of a gap there because of that. So, yeah, Dragnet, I think, I mean, the Derby was fantastic for those of you guys who got to watch it. I thought I was fine with the splitting horses between distances. But I also, respect the hell out of Zook for only racing Dank and not trying to split it up. Yeah, Gutters, no problem. I think you can make the argument that future tournaments should be one horse at different distances. I think there were a bunch of events before the Digital Derby. This was kind of the highest production value and a lot more eyeballs than some of these other events. But the Pony Plug guys, and Zombie Racing, and a bunch, and I'm leaving out a bunch of guys because I don't always participate in tournaments, but a lot of people have put on interesting events, and I think that we'll just see more and more of these tournaments in different formats, and I think that's great for the game. So I think you can debate until everybody's face turns blue about what the best format for a tournament is. I honestly think that having a bunch of different formats, looking at bloodline tournaments and distance tournaments and single horse or multi-horse or stable wide or whatever, I think the more tournaments we can have, the more people we get racing, the better for the game. So yeah, Dragnout. I've been joking with the guys. I think a lot of people, there's a healthy mix of racing, real life racing knowledge versus ZED knowledge in our group and on this stream. I just because you're interested in ZED doesn't mean you're necessarily interested in real life racing, but I think it is really interesting to see the crossovers. I've started paying a lot less attention to real life racing now that I'm into ZED, but I always do like flipping on some of the late night West Coast races in the States or the Aussie races during the day, and then I'm looking forward to the Breeders' Cup, obviously. So doubt I'll make it out there to the West Coast this year, but it's always a fantastic event. Humans obvious. Can you explain the curves on Know Your Horse? What curves are you looking for? That's a good question. So there are a bunch of different curves, and I think depending on who you ask, Dragnet. I'm not gonna. I think every racing has its real life racing has its positives, right? You have some really interesting formats in Europe. You have a lot of good turf racing in Australia, and then I would argue that the best dirt races in the world are in the U.S. and the best synthetic races in the world are in Asia. So depending on what surface you like and what horses you like watching, it's, there's a lot to like in a lot of different locations. So, but to humans and zombies question about what you can look at. So I pulled up this horse before, which I think Dragnet will recognize, but I'm going to go back to an interesting horse that I always kind of go back to. For me, the curves that show up on the horse's main page mean a lot more to me than any other curves that you can find on KYH. So your placements curve and your odds curve. And so, depending on the shape of the odds curve and the shape of the placements curve, that's going to indicate what races you should be running. And for me, I like to use the drill down function within know your horse's structure and look at different classes and how the curves change, and then, specific distances and kind of what that looks like. And so, and then you can look at specific races and look at the competition in those races, or you can specifically look at the curves and kind of get an idea, the stats, the win percentages, the ROI. Again, we'll talk more about racing and specific horses in our pop-up streams, and we will have other general racing streams. We'll probably do more of a racing stream next week. We're still working with MJ and a couple of the other groups on kind of what day is what. So just keep an eye, drop us a follow if you haven't, and keep an eye on the XYZED Run Twitter. We're going to try to be a little more active with that. And then if you follow us on Twitch, you'll get notified, assuming you have that set up whenever we go live. So I know I didn't answer in a lot of detail on the curves, but the other thing that you may be asking about is the speed analysis curves. My argument, CJ's argument, I think some other people that we talk to more often than not, we argue that the placements have a large correlation with what these speed curves look like. And by the time you have enough races for the speed curves to matter or tell you definitive information, you can generally see that from the odds and from the placements curves. And even when odds go away, you should be able to see that from the flames, assuming that they're implemented how we think they will be. But that said, you can use the speed curves under speed analysis to look at, where the horse might be slower than average or faster than average, and use that to your advantage. So, Gags, that's a good comment. I'd say I probably watch 25% of my races now. I'm not the biggest racer, but yeah, Greeno, that's a great point on the speed curves. Flatter, wider curves could indicate where you have more variance, and the position of the curve compared to average could also indicate variance. But again, I think the better way to look at it is looking at your speed stats, looking at where your highest standard deviations are, and then comparing that to your placements at any given distance. I think that's generally how we believe that speed has value. So I don't look specifically at race times or speed numbers at all. And I don't believe CJ does either. But I think you can look at the variance of the curves, look at the standard deviation data here, and use that to inform your racing decisions a little bit better. But yeah, Gags, to your point about watching races, I certainly don't watch every race anymore. I think watching 40 or 50 races a day for the better part of the first month that I was involved with ZED took that out of me. But I do think that to pointing to some controversial comments made in chat, I do think that you can watch races and look at slow finishes or fast finishes and start to see variance in the horse's running style. I don't think that you can look at the running time or when a horse breaks or the timing of furlongs or anything like that, because I think in the end you're just trying to get to an end speed which is dictated by your placement. So I still watch about 25% of my races, or maybe a little bit less, because it's still fun. If you don't look at the result, that's part of the entertainment value of ZED is, even if you look at the odds, as long as you're not pulling 20 plus or 30 plus odds, you still have a decent chance. So alpha. So is the distance variable increase? Yeah. So sorry, guys. I hit the back button. So I think the easiest way to look at it is if you are looking at, let me remind myself of the question. Hey, Stanley, what's going on, man? Where was the question? So yeah, distances. So if you're looking at distance profile on a horse like Main Event, you don't see. So you don't see a lot of odds variance, right? So what we were talking a little bit about earlier is if you look at Moolah Moolah, you have this. I think this is only one or two races at 1,600, and so as you get further away from 16 in both directions, your odds get better. And so when you're looking at the races, there's a chance that you could be just as strong at 2,000, or just because the odds are getting marginally better as you go away doesn't necessarily mean that 2,600 is definitely going to be your best distance. You still have to look at placements at each of these distances and your performance against the competition and figure out what the best distance for you is. And what you'll see is a lot of this type of horse, so that they don't have to run against Moolah or LBJ Goat or any of the top horses that look like this at 2,400. They'll still drop into the 2,000 and 2,200 races because they have good odds. And they're maybe not as competitive at the longer distance, but they're still very competitive at 2,000 or 2,200. No, I mean, what we were saying earlier a little bit is oftentimes when you see the great odds out here, you'll still see good odds here. And so, you'll see a little bit of a U depending on kind of how you balance your races run. Yeah, Stanley, no, that's a good point on LBJ. I mean, that just because your horse has better odds at at one of these longer distances doesn't mean that it's not going to actually perform better at 2,000 or 2,200 or something like that. Just like the short distance, Mirajo is actually better than Poodle at 1,000, but Poodle is significantly better at 1,200. So, and then Crimson Chin crushes them both at both. So, it applies just as much with the short distances as the long distances. The reverse is true. So. Yeah. Souls, there are definitely horses out there that have been run at certain distances, opposite distances than they should be. So their finishing patterns would look a little bit different. Their profitability statistics would look a little bit different. I'm sure you wouldn't be surprised, but there are definitely mismanaged horses out there across the board. Not that CJ or I are the best quote unquote trainers in the game or anything like that. But as far as identifying patterns and looking at how horses are running, we tend to think similarly. And again, we think speed can be a tool, but it's not a deterministic tool. It's something that is developed as your racing profile develops. Yeah, local boy. I think that's a really good question. So I don't know if you're talking about specific horses or just kind of my comments. My comment just now about certain horses beating other horses or comparing horse shapes. I think it's hard to look at head-to-head. Head-to-head is one factor. It's hard to look at head-to-head data alone, though, because there are different profiles of horses that affect each other differently. So you have kind of consistently flat odds horses like Main Event that are better at specific distances. Generally the ones that he's running, but also good at some other distances that he doesn't run as much. And then you have horses that prefer shorter or longer distances and have their odds curves relatively flat, but still leaning one way or the other. And then you have the spiker example. I call them spikers because their odds spike at 1,600. You have spikers, and then you have weaker versions of those. So you have your kind of leaning odds, which I call wedges, and then you have kind of a spiker combined with that, which we call ledges. So you've got spikers with crazy odds at 1,600 and usually higher odds at 1,400 and 1,800 as well. And then you've got different odds shapes across the board, and each of those horses are going to affect each other differently. So just because that's why sometimes you see a horse pull a 7 versus a 9 in one race head to head, and then the very next race one horse pulls a 14. The horse that pulled a 7 pulls a 14, and the horse that pulls a 9 pulls a 8.5 or a 9 again. And so it's all about who's in that race and how those horses are compared against each other. So if you look at the same 12 horses running in the same distance, in the same class, so same horses, there's less than a 10% variance between those fields. It's only happened a couple of times, but the odds do vary very slightly, 5 to 10% different. And if you look at different distances, though, with the same 12 horses, you will start to see odds move around because of horses' distance preferences. Yeah, Alpha, yeah, Dragnet, appreciate you guys tuning in, and obviously appreciate the time you're spending with us, and the follows, and asking good questions and helping us kind of create content here, because we could talk about stuff all night, but it's a lot easier to kind of work through your questions and kind of work together on how to figure out this game together. So again, I know we mentioned it a lot earlier, but really appreciate you guys tuning in, and all your good questions. Saw some new faces tonight, and a good number of old faces as well. So always appreciate the support. I am winding down a little bit. We're going on 3 hours. So yeah, any other questions, I'm happy to answer the next 5 or 10 minutes. And yeah, otherwise, follow us, and we're working on kind of a midweek stream being our main stream, trying not to overlap with Pony Plug too much. I know we kind of hijacked some of their viewers tonight, but we're going to try to balance it so that you guys have content to see a lot of different nights. And I think we're all working together to make this a better game and a better ecosystem. So yeah, Pyro, thanks for joining. Again, sorry about the drop a couple minutes ago, but you guys, again, really appreciate everything, and we will likely have some sort of racing pop up later this week, where we will take some of the information that I talked through earlier, looking at curves. We'll analyze specific horses. Some of you have been, present the last couple that we've had, but just keep an eye out, and we'll try to give at least a few hours heads up, if not a day's heads up, when that'll happen. And then we will also announce our stream next week, where we will likely focus on a little bit more racing again. And it'll depend on kind of how well the fee rollout goes on Friday, how much we talk about that. And then, a lot of horses are resetting later this week, so we may talk about breeding a little bit more next week as well. So, but Alpha, yeah, let's table that for a couple of days from now. Or, as I mentioned, if you search for Quest Racing in the ZED General Discord, you can shoot me a DM on Discord. And I'll try to get back to you either tonight or tomorrow there. So, yeah, Dragnet, I'll talk to you. I'll talk to you offline. I know we have a little DM chain going. So, but all right, guys, we're right on 3 hours. So again, really appreciate everybody jumping on, staying with us for the long haul tonight, and we will we'll hopefully see you in the next couple of days, and then we'll definitely put a larger announcement out for next week. So everybody have a great night or a great day for those of you joining from Australia, and we'll talk to you again soon. Also keep an eye out on our Twitch page for the Discord link. We probably won't tweet that out, but if you're following and you keep an eye on the page, if we're ready to drop that in the next couple of days, we will. So keep an eye out for that. Otherwise, we'll talk a little bit more about that this weekend, and we should be ready at that point. So thanks, guys. Have a great night, great day, and talk soon.